Stiegler connection is very important, obviously, as with Kittler. Both Kittler and Stiegler do not really read Benjamin, the way they read Heidegger, in terms of the intensity. And in fact, I don't know much about, Kittler's relationship to Benjamin. I'll look into it, but certainly Stiegler doesn't really have an active level. But I do want to begin today just with one notion etymologically. The term that I was distinguishing between and that we saw in Heidegger also works in Benjamin. The German word for experience, Erfahrung, literally comes from fahren, to travel. So it is really the traveling or the depth of experience that is being talked about in this sense. The Erfahrung is a very, very important word in Benjamin. He is looking at this consistently. He wrote an early essay on experience in which he engages this notion of Erfahrung, and that's what's lacking in the everyday. I think that's one thing we really need to keep in mind going forward. He does share that with Heidegger, probably in a different way, more of a cosmopolitanism and a kind of the traveling aspect of it. But for Heidegger, it's more of the interior traveling. So anyway, I was just going to begin by going back to his background, just a little bit of the biographical and the ideational in Benjamin. One of the great influences on Benjamin early and on a lot of the Weimar intellectuals was a man named Karl Splittler, who was a contemporary of Nietzsche. They taught together in Basel. And he wrote a great poem called The Olympian Spring that was taken up by many composers and other people. But his great poem, and we'll go back to this, was an allegoric poem before that called Prometheus and Epimetheus. And with Stiegler, we'll talk about these two Greek myths in terms of the default and the I guess I'm the host. I have to let people in. Okay. Between the Epimethean fault and the Promethean energy of the stealing from the gods, and in a way, the work was used by Jung, the ex-Freudian Jungian, right, in his work on the psychological types and the notion of Prometheus, the sufferer. So the archetypes of the anima is also used there. The reason I mention him is that this is part of the early free school treatment that Benjamin was recruited, like our friend Stanley Aronowitz, by the Zionists to go to their school, but instead he ended up at a free school, right? A free school which was very open in terms of reading such people as Stiegler already. And one of the notions which was kind of interesting was that they had during this period, that ultimately God was dumb and never foresaw anything. So this was a kind of dismantling of the Promethean myth, that God wasn't so smart that as the Promethean energies, etc. So kind of funny. And then the error of God, the big error, was giving Epimetheus, and we'll go back to this with Stiegler, his earthly kingdom. And I'm doing this because Benjamin's first work was really on allegory. He was really very, Walter Benjamin's major ambition, and he announced this, was to be the greatest living literary critic. This is really his ambition. And unlike Heidegger, who never really read the novel as form, I'm sure he read some novels, Benjamin was immersed in novels, short stories, children's stories, and obviously a lot of popular culture. So there's a tremendous difference in terms of what is entering or what is part of the protension, retentional, structure of these two different consciousnesses and ultimately their material production and where they go. So, anyway, so we'll go back to this because this is an interesting story that comes out of Basel, the University of Basel, by someone that's hardly known or written about in the United States, Karl Spittler, the Swiss poet, who was actually a student of Jakob Burckhardt, which is, the major historian of the Renaissance. He coined the term, by the way, the Renaissance. Burckhardt. He was a colleague of Nietzsche's and, a pretty major art critic that was known very, very much. So you have to remember too, to just set the stage here a little bit, that Benjamin is, working in the background, of course, of, Kant's third critique, the critique of judgment, which was a handbook, of course, for the Museum of, Beaux-Arts in Paris, used very much for that. How do we make artistic and aesthetic judgments versus that of taste? What is the notion of the sublime? All of these categories were very much part of German art criticism during the 19th century and then picked up in the 20th century. So this really goes back, and Benjamin's relationship to Kant was through a man named Hermann Cohen, who was the Jewish philosopher who read Kant in a very imaginative way. He was a neo-Kantian, but he was an imaginative neo-Kantian who, again, took this concept of Erfahrung much deeper than Kant. One of Benjamin's critiques of Kant on experience was that Kant's category of experience was bland, dry, dull, and had really ultimately no life to it, right? So he was trying to give it some kind of life in this way. And he wrote this in the Coming Program in Philosophy, which was one of his texts when he was working on his doctorate. The Coming Program in Philosophy would begin with Kant, but injected with a life in terms of the notion of this Erfahrung and this experiential content. He also criticized Kant for being very mechanistic and, completely, dominated, if you will, by the Newtonian, science of the day. So so in 1916, going back here just a little bit. So in his youth, he's very much influenced by free thinking, free-spirited Jews, which were part of a culture. This is a culture that is really developing around, after Lessing, after Mendelssohn, et cetera. The Spinoza struggle is happening also in the late 18th century, early 19th century. Of course, the Schlegel brothers, Frederick and August Schlegel. So all of these things are going on in this kind of backdrop that produces these free schools, these free thinkers, if you will, at the turn of the century and a little later. Of course, Lukács in Budapest is having a similar kind of experience with, Bela Balzak, the film theorist. And of course, Bartók was Lukács's best friend. So they were very, very close. So Lukács is having this background too, and you can look at his early history, very similar in some ways to Benjamin, not as much around the children's stories and the kind of delight in fantasy, but certainly the reading of, some kind of, I'll put it in very broad terms, this kind of level of interpretation that goes back to the Torah and the Kabbalah, this kind of mixture, if you will, in some senses, that they both shared. Lukács's book, The Soul in Its Form, right? All leading up to the theory of the novel, the Heidelberg aesthetics, are all permeated by these kind of categories, such as experience as well. So structural Marxists do not like the notion of experience, by the way. There's always this battle that goes on. The structuralist Marxists do not like this notion of experience. But certainly the Frankfurt School, Benjamin very much, and Heidegger in a different way. So, and of course, one of the more sophisticated works of Husserl was a book called Experience and Judgment, how we make judgment separation through this category of Erfahrung and the lived every day, too, the vécu in the Sartrean existential sense. But anyway, so the childhood is very rich. I mean, I go on, a very good book could be written about this and how he, again, remembers so much of his childhood too. And remember in the reading, you see he looks at Alice in Wonderland, he looks at Mickey Mouse, he looks at, many aspects of popular culture that we kind of deny. Alice in Wonderland with Gary Cooper as the White Knight, right? These are very interesting moments in Benjamin that you would not get one iota from Adorno or in another way Horkheimer and much of the snobbery that goes on in the early parts of Marxist cultural studies. Anyway, so in 1915, a crucial relationship, and I'm sure you know a lot of this, with Gershom Scholem, they met actually at a club. I mean, at a university and at a club. And Scholem was the first one to give him a copy of the writings of Rosa Luxemburg and Franz Mehring on theory and practice of Marxism. This was called the International Group that later was to become the German Communist Party. So this is a very interesting moment in his history where he's passed for the first time, something that is of the moment, the Luxemburgist, and Franz Mehring wrote one of the best biographies of Marx, still stands the test of time. Another person. So the journal, by the way, which was called Theory and Practice or Praxis, was dissolved after the first issue by the government, not by the internal struggles, etc. So it's kind of interesting. You get a taste of Babylon, Berlin, Weimar very early with these moments as early as 1915, right? And as most of you know, the Social Democrats were part of the plan to assassinate Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, her co-author. So anyway, 1916, after this encounter with Scholem, he begins his kind of literary career. He writes the tragic drama, and tragedy, on the role of language in the tragedy and in the Trostspiel and in the German tragic drama, and then on language as such and the language of man, which are the early elements of his theories of language as a pristine, atomic, coming to names, right? He really wanted to go back to this kind of almost call it a radical innocence, in which we began to name things again in its pristineness. Again, this kind of new experience, right? We're so far away from these primordial meanings, or probably better put, or phenomena meanings, right? Kind of the or text of the phenomena, to get back to this kind of notion of language. And he would play this out his whole life, very, very attuned, as you notice probably in the work of art in the age of technical reproduction, or in the or technological reproduction is probably better, or he mentions many things about the Nazi appropriation of and this has always been a thing. For whom does one write? How does one code? How does one get outside and protects, language as such? This has been one of Benjamin's very long-term projects, right? So he talks about the original sin in language, the spiritual body in the world, as it's expressed in language, the non-instrumental divine world, what he calls, of vessels that we are. He and Heidegger have that together, as André Breton, the surrealist, that the human subject, if you will, is a communicating vessel. For Heidegger, we're there through which something passes. We're topos, or there through which, moves through us as Dasein, or beings in the world. And of course, Benjamin, in this sense, that we have this kind of communicating vessels we are, and Breton too had this notion, very close to the surrealist notion was Benjamin, and vice versa. So, the where he really wanted to go it was, in his words, and I've read this essay pretty carefully. I used to read it alongside Derrida way back in the day. There was a lot of connections trying to make between Derrida and Benjamin, that it was a sphere of worldlessness, right? That really where language was. This is where he was really trying to go, to awaken the interest in what was really denied to the world. So he was really trying to think this through in a very, very originary phenomenological way, right? And he called it the experience of the ineffable, right? Which would be a great phrase and a good thing to, kind of subvert the experience of the ineffable, right? Right. So it's not ever the communication of content, passe, to all that want always explanation. It's not to be the communication, but it's the disclosure, if you will, is the idea of language, of magical effects, and its pristineness, right? And he really talked about language as having almost a suprachemical effect. He would go through this, that, ultimately that, literary criticism, the critic himself was the great strategist. This is one part of his ambition, was the great strategist that would really look at, this kind of suprachemical effect, and magical effects in the world and in all of, before the world. So against content reading, against, if you will, interpretation in some ways, against hermeneutics in some ways. He's always trying to get even further than this circumlocution, this circumscribed region, in a sense, to get to something even deeper, this earth phenomena. So for him, the criticism is the illumination. It's not a clearing, but the criticism is what illuminates and differentiates the genuine, the authentic, from the inauthentic. Yeah, this is what the criticism does, and that right, that you would have this kind of he spoke of the comic of those, or the comic as something that's very interesting in laughter, as that which radiate excessively, right? And he liked that very much. I think he saw this in Chaplin very, very well too. This kind of delight in, kind of the magic of this, excessive radiation, if you will, radiating like the sun's rays, right, et cetera, in the light, et cetera. So for him, criticism is the decomposition of language, not the possible assertion, if you will, of its efficaciousness. So he's totally against any instrumental usage of language. Language is a communication of content, etc. So hence the aphoristic style that he uses much of, and the montage effects. He's really trying to play with form, if you will, that is cut or sever, right? This kind of notion of content or form content dichotomies in many ways. So he has this going on. So this is all going on very early in Benjamin's life. He's only at this point 25, 26 years old. World War I, etc. He meets Schlolem, very important for him. The writing of this, the thinking through the language in a way, the ambition to become the leading literary critic of his era. And it really is in some ways you could put it the language, the atomic language of things. You come to things themselves, right? The things themselves. There's no subject here, no subjectivity. It's all a predication, if you will, of things. And you actually, in a sense, the object for Benjamin, or if you will, his, again, another ambition is to render nature unmuted, right? To make nature speak, if you will, this earth phenomena, in so many ways. So this seems to be very much part of his entire, career here. Yeah, Carl, yeah.
Oh, just a question with
Yeah, sure.
the so what you're saying about his approach to language, would it be another way to say it that it's a form of revelation in some sense? I
There
mean,
is revelation going on, yes,
it's
but I
not
mean,
like explanation or
certainly not in
concept,
the, yeah, yeah, it's again an unconcealment, if you will, but in his case, it's not the Heideggerian circle.
but it's
Circle of
magical,
person.
you said. You used
It's
the word
what?
magical. You used,
Magical effects. Yeah, yeah, the
yeah.
magic is always there. Yes, yes.
Mm.
The magical quality of things. I've always thought of cinema that way. It leaves this magical effect on you. It certifies I wrote something on film way back in the day that it certifies reality, right? It has this magical effect on this magical quality. Not all film, but when we'll talk about this, of course, but this magical quality. And Benjamin is trying to go there with language. You have to remember again, this privileging of language is something very much in the air, right? at this time, yeah, very, very, very much in the air. And ultimately, it's very, very important to remember. I'll read you. I mean, I found something of Derrida from Ghostly Demarcations, just to give you an idea of how this played out later. And this was in a reading when he published Spectres of Marx, a little bit too late for my taste. He took until very late in his life to encounter Marx, and he did so through Hamlet. But but anyway, there was a conference on his work called Ghostly Demarcations, and the text by Derrida was called Marx and Sons. In the good Jewish tradition, right? Rothschild and Sons, Marx and Sons, right? Claims have been also advanced to the effect that the question of Maranism, the Marano Jews, the wanderers, those who were converted to Christianity in some ways, was recently closed for good. I don't believe it for a second, he says, right? There are still sons and daughters who, unbeknownst to themselves, incarnate or psychosize the ventriloquist specters of their ancestors. And this is, in a way, maybe what Benjamin was trying to do, keep this ancestry really alive. This may have been a function of the Kabbalah. I don't know the Judaic tradition in this sense, but, he does have this really, really strong effect, right, of the Kabbalah as a subversive reading key, right, in his work. This is part of the relationship to Sholem. And at the same time, again, to be against just the communicative, efficacious natures of language itself, right, of language, right? Yeah. And I mean, one could, again, do a very good polemic with Jean-Paul Sartre, who said language is really about communication. He writes this, for whom do one write? What is literature? Sartre does this after the war, and very different. I think Sartre's very naive about language, but anyway, we can talk about that later. So anyway, I would just like, the reason I'm doing this is because in a certain way, this is a very subversive work, the work of art in the age of, technical reproduction, or the technological reproduction. And also, just to give you an idea, this is someone his whole life, I don't know if you've looked at the Arcades project, but he's looking at everything in the world. It's eye and hand together and the word. Eye, hand, and word. It's a very beautiful, to me, it's a really very sensuous, beautiful approach to language. It's much more sensual than our friend Heidegger. Much rather be having a drink with Benjamin in Berlin than Heidegger in the Black Forest. But anyway, that's a preference, And Benjamin went to jazz clubs too, so Heidegger didn't really write on jazz or anything. Anyway, I'll do this. This is again an attempt here, with all due respect to Heidegger, to talk about cosmopolitanism, right, in a different way that Heidegger seemed to shun away from, in many ways, even though the thought is so, powerful, and so, in other words, this violent reappropriation of the tradition. So anyway, so this decomposition of language to, not the positive assertion of its efficaciousness, but to go back and render nature no longer mute. I think this is very important to keep in mind as we go through this. So anyway, the next shift, if you will, if you know, after this early attempt to look at the Trauspiel tragedy, language as such, and the language of man, was a period of 1917, you know, and World War I until 24, you know, the enormous amount of inflation that has started in Weimar, et cetera. And he writes something called painting and the graphic arts. So if anybody's interested in enhancing their thinking about Benjamin vis-a-vis the arts, painting and the graphic arts is written in 1917, and it follows, you know, the difference between painting to the very root, the study of planes, and he looks at painting as sign and mark together, one as vertical and one as mark. So again, you have almost this notion of the language of painting too, the verticality of the signs and the mark on the horizon. So he goes through this very, very early on. The root for painting, mal in German, you know, mark, right, is the root for painting, part of the root word. And Zeichen, sign, is part of the root for drawing. So this is a kind of interesting connection that he's making early on based on, again, his etymological search, if you will, for the authentic meaning, if you will, of words, right? And this. And of course, then, you know, as most of you know, the icon for Benjamin was Angelus Novus of Paul Klee, and we'll get there in a second. Also in 1917, of course, as I mentioned, he wrote the Coming Program in Philosophy, which was a criticism of Kant's, you know, lifeless definition of experience, too tied to the Newtonian moment of mathematical and mechanistic Enlightenment physics, and the imposition of finitude onto the infinite, right? And Benjamin is also trying to incorporate this into his views about painting, right, and drawing as well, right? So he's trying to look at this in terms of the absolute space, right, versus this finite and infinite, right, thing. And so language is where philosophy has its critical, you know, the expression, right, and it's not through numbers, right? It's through again this notion of experience, right? He wants to do this, wants to get away from the mathematical ontology. Then he has a 1918 essay called On Criticism, Art Criticism, and in German Romanticism, and this is where he wants to talk about poetic writing and art forms, and this is the beginning of his encounter with Baudelaire, which is very important to him. You know, I don't know if you've read you know, Lyric Poet in the Age of High Capitalism. It's a magnificent, has anybody read this? It's a magnificent study of Baudelaire. I mean, really worth reading to look at, you know, in the Second Empire, you know, high lyric poet, you know, in the age of high capitalism. And, you know, yeah, very, very beautiful engagement with Baudelaire's policy. And of course, the two texts that he's reading are Artificial Paradise, yeah, and of course the use of hashish, and paraspleen, the use of drugs. So opium and hashish play out actively in terms of the pharmacon. Doug is probably resting from the pharmacon anyway. But anyway, we you know, have this in Benjamin, very operative. You know, he wrote a piece called Hashish in Marseille, very important, and he talks about what hashish actually does, right? So he really wanted to talk about the alternate, then they, with Gershom Schlem, they try to build an alternative university, which is a parody of the boredom that they're both experiencing at the university at that time. And they call it the University of Mari, M-A-R-I. And they invent this very parodic university of all their professors. So that, you know, Benjamin is very, you know, clever on the one hand, devious, you know, and creatively acts out, I think, in a very, very good way. And then he had an experience with, he read Kandinsky, concerning the spiritual in art, alongside Ernst Bloch's Spirit of Utopia. And this also seemed to influence him tremendously in this period, right? Well, so, we'll get to this with Josh and, all of you, of course, but, where does Benjamin kind of come down on the plastic arts, the spatial arts, what is really happening in this piece. And, that's why I'm doing this background. Something as an aside, very important is the critique of violence, which I have read with at least two people here. I mean, I know we read it when we were writing Revolution in the Virocene, the critique of violence, which is actually a long meditation, and Patrick probably knows this, and all of you probably know that this is a meditation on Sorel, right? And the general strike. Yeah. And he makes this wonderful distinction between the mythical violence of the state and, of course, the divine violence of, which is much more pure, and the act of proletarian strikes, right? Is much more of a divine, the act of revolutionary violence, right? Is of divine origin. So he goes through this very thing. I won't go through it all, but it's certainly worth reading, as since violence comes up all the time. And I think it's a great beginning to rereading Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, the first chapter concerning violence. This is a very, very, very important, thing for our times. And then, Cassira, who was a colleague, they were not friends, but Cassira did end up at the Warburg Institute, as I mentioned, Ernst Cassira, the Great Enlightenment, the Kantian, who wrote on the symbolic forms, great book, 3-4 volumes, I think it is. Suzanne Langer, Philosophy in a New Key, takes a point of departure from Cassira. But anyway, Cassira wrote a book, The Myth of the State, in which sort of follows up on Benjamin, the state as the mythical violence, right, in a way. And something we forget a lot about is the study of these myths and how they perpetrate throughout us. Very, very few people want, they want to demythologize, etc., instead of understanding. And myth in Greek, really, mythos, means the beginning. It means to begin, muthin. It's a beginning. It's very revolutionary in terms of building something. And Jean-Francois Lyotard, I'm riffing a little bit, but forgive me, but Jean-Francois Lyotard, I mean, I have a lot of Benjamin in me. The Lyotard, the Different, right, begins with, here is the story of so and so, right? He begins with a myth, right? Yeah. So, etc. Right? Okay. So anyway, then he writes the Elective Affinities essay. This is on Goethe. And then he speaks about, excuse me, he adopts this Angelus Novus. It's sold, by the way, Paul Klee's Angelus Novus sold for 1,000 marks. You can imagine that deal, right? 1,000 marks during that period. And he comes up through a study of his child, and I know you'll be interested in this, Beryl, what he calls the mimetic capability of the child. And he's studying this through his young son, Stefan, which is with his first wife, Dora, who they had a very tumultuous relationship. Benjamin had 4 major, I know a lot about him in terms of that. He had four lovers. Greta Rett was the first one in school, then Dora Kellner, who he married, then of course Jula Kohn, and then finally Asia Lakis, who changed his life really, and we'll talk about her in a minute. So this mimetic capability of the child, very, very important for him when he goes through some of the theories of representation and the mimetic capabilities in the art forms that he studied, painting, photography, obviously film, etc. We'll go over that. So anyway, he wrote a long, and I won't read you this, but he had a very good protest against money. I'll put it out with Matt. We'll put it on the website next week. I don't want to read the whole thing to you, but it's part of something that I always admired about Benjamin, about money, how personal relationships are always become superhuman, piercing clarity in which they're scarcely able to survive. He goes on this in the sense and how trust and everything is almost impossible, calm and health. And, we're living through that right now because of the, quote, obviously, money economy. And I think Zimmel, for some of you that studied the philosophy of money, actually picks up on this in a very good way, in his thinking about money. So he began to read Lukács in the 1920s. We're really taken by him, and he created this tension between his own theories, the Hegelian dialectics, if you will, of Lukács. In some ways, history and class consciousness is still smacks of Hegelian dialectics. It's not totally a Marxist materialist account, and Lukács admits to this. And, I don't know if many of you know this, but De Rovin and others put Lukács on trial in 1927-28, and he has to defend history and class consciousness to, in the Soviet Union when he's there. But anyway, so and Benjamin writes about this contrast with Hegelian dialectics and his own nihilism. So this is another important part that somehow Benjamin never really read Hegel that seriously. He may have read parts of the aesthetics, but never really became a Hegelian Marxist in many ways. If you want to look at that, he was much more interesting in things like the nihilism of say the surrealists, but how it became dialectical. And Susan Buck Morse, by the way, if you become a fanatic on Benjamin, the book on dialectical optics is very good. Her studies of Benjamin. She's one of the best scholars, right, on dialectical objects. Yeah. You know Susan? Susan, or she's in New York.
She's written. I think she's written on the arcades. She wrote a whole book on the arcades, didn't she? And and she writes amazingly about those early years with Asilasis. Because if I could just gloss this a minute, I mean, I was interested in what you were saying about this continuity of language and messianic time, because a lot of Benjamin scholars, they like to posit this break, which I think there is a break between the earlier so-called Kantian Benjamin and then the transition towards Marxism and the kind of uneasy. But I think all of Benjamin's relationships and all of his kind of theories were always uneasy. You don't see a consistency. What you see is him picking things. Would you agree with that? I mean,
I do agree with this. I agree that in a way you can locate the break maybe with Lacus and that relationship and his exposure to Brecht and others, and of course, the Frankfurt School in many ways too. But at the same time, he retained much of this childhood memories, the Berlin childhood, the one-way street, all these things. And he worked in radio too. I mean, again, when I spoke Cosmopolitan, this was an amazing figure, of this period, he had a radio program too, and I was going to go over that as well. But I agree with you, and I think it's a scholarly thing. Sometimes it's a simplistic way. You divide people into periods, and you say they broke or whatever. I think it's best to look at the totality, not closed totality, but basically keep the totality open of the work.
I agree. I think what makes him so frustrating to Adorno, particularly later in life, is precisely that Benjamin just could not pursue that, and he didn't have an academic career, so he was forced by necessity to become a journalist, a literary critic. So that allowed him to expand in these ways. And his relationship with Baudelaire and Proust, I think, is just seminal in that respect.
He never would have been Walter Benjamin if he had become an academic. I'll just put it out. I mean, I think that's a good working premise, that sometimes the academy kills this kind of creativity. And especially for someone like Walter Benjamin. This was a real edge that he had. And he had the background, the wherewithal, the scope, right, to be able to do so much too. He could write journalistic. He was one of the early people to really look at popular culture, and look at it outside of just, simple, usage, right? He thought about this. very actively. Yeah. So anyway, yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, one way of going about it, I was just going to say, he loved the children manipulation of fairy tales. Again, for you, Beryl, I mean, maybe you could study his relationship with Stefan. He got a lot out of this. This was a very, very interesting moment in his, he really loved the kid. He wrote a lot about this. He had, it was kind of like, Freud with Anna, or, the childhood narratives of childhood analysis, like Melanie Klein, but very different, much more creative in my opinion. Yeah. So, yeah. So, yeah, and then the other thing is the montage between rags and refuge, right? He's always dealing with that, right? The rags and the refuge. He's always looking at the refuge. If I were to write on Benjamin Mead today, it would be, love and taste in the ruins, or something like that. He's always thinking of the ruins of a civilization, in a sense. So this, to me, and I think early on, he's thinking this way. Why does he turns to tragedy early on? He writes about language. He wants to get back to this pristine experience, etc. And this rags and refuge plays out very actively in the Arcades project. Very active. Where a postcard, an object in an antique shop, a flower pot, etc. All of these, he could have been a great film director, in my opinion. If I had been around and I was Sam Goldwyn, I would have hired Louis B. Mayer. I would have hired Benjamin to do all these great films. I mean, he's much more creative than Disney in some ways, even though he had this admiration for Mickey Mouse and I don't know if admiration's the right word, but anyway, the use value of Mickey Mouse, etc. Right. Okay. So,
Professor, just
yes,
one
sir.
thing for those
Yeah.
interested. This is the book by Susan Buck Morse. I think you were mentioning.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Okay.
The dialectics of seeing, right?
Yeah.
Is the title The Dialectics of Seeing?
Right, exactly.
He wrote very good things for New German Critique, if you don't want to read the whole book, on the flaneur, the sandwich man, and the whore. He was very good at this stuff. He was very good. You have to remember, this was a time in which anything could be written about in a very creative way. It wasn't just like journalism 101, right? These people really, really had it for this. And the flaneur is taken, of course, from Baudelaire. Okay? Yeah. And very, very, the sandwich man is the guy that walks down the street with the two sides, right? Of the sign, yeah. It's ripped off by this guy that did the Joker, right? With the Joachim Phoenix, this remake, this kind of fascist attempt recently. It goes to show you how much is borrowed and stolen. So anyway, the idea, he's beginning to switch here. I mean, one way you could do his career is look at the new forms that are created. So montage becomes a central idea for him. Yeah. A central idea during this period, in the 1917 to 24 seems to be crucial in terms of the development, if you will, of Benjamin. So the reading of Lukács, the beginning of using montage in his work, etc. And then this is one of the best parts to me. I mean, I love this because I keep books of quotations and, citations and all of this. Quotations used as detonators, as explosives, right, of ideas that blasted against the content to produce a montage. This is really what he was always doing with the ideas. That's the revolutionary impact of Walter Benjamin, right? The fragmentary and aphoristic always, the montage, right? As the body of material understudy. Yeah, this refuge, these rags, this glissant, these remains, if you will. That's the remains. Did you want to say something, Douglas?
No, I'm good. I'm listening.
Okay, I thought you were going through the book with. Okay. Good.
No, I'm just. I agree. I agree with everything you're saying. I mean, this period. Yeah.
Okay. And then of course there's the language theory that he's developing. So you have this montage of the Kabbalah through Sholem, and he continues letters, and the friendship never dissolves. It's an ongoing friendship, despite his turn towards a more militant Marxism, after visiting the Soviet Union, etc. The Platonic idealism stays with him throughout, I think. There's a universal singularity that he gets from Croce, the Italian, and I wish our friend Bruno was here because I'm now detecting where he gets the theory of the singular beyond Duns Scotus, right, from Croce. Leibnizian monadism, and then, it's always the moment in relationship to the interpreters, this whole theory of the moment and moments, right? So this is all going on, from 17 to 24. And then there's another move that he has to make. He spends time in Paris, etc. But he goes to Frankfurt for a little while. And that's where the radio stuff goes on in Frankfurt, right? And there he was exposed to plays by Brecht, Wilde, Hans Flesch, etc. And he writes the manuscript One Way Street, which is, and then he makes this move, I think out of complete boredom probably, and exposure to French modernism. He starts to read the surrealists, particularly Breton, right? What is surrealism? Communicating vessels, mad love, of course, Amour fou. And then, of course, what's his name? Desnos, Robert Desnos, and other the surrealists. And he begins to say, understand that the psychoanalysis in the surrealist is not of the self, right? Or the subject, it's really of the objects, right? The psychoanalysis of the objects, right? And, in some ways, when Lacan says the ego is in the room, right, is actually repeating this surrealist proposition, if you will. The ego is not, but it's in the room, right? This world of objects, etc. So this could be interesting to talk about versus in the text itself. And then, of course, he wants to he studies Mallarmé, Coupe de Des, which some of us have read here. I think Sean and Josh in particular, we did a looking at that, and I always recommend Every Revolution is a Throw of the Die by Chantal Akerman, the filmmaker, who's died a few years ago, actually committed suicide, unfortunately. And then and then he goes to Apollinaire's calligrams, right? And this use of language again, right? From this kind of new topography that takes place with Mallarmé and the graphic. And so he's really becoming much more of a modernist here, right? In many ways. I think this is a kind of change in what's going on, and more openness towards what's happening at the time. The ideographic logic of if you will, of spatial dislocations and dispositions, and a turn away from narrative. No more narrative. And, Godard replays this, by the way, when he does very good interviews with, what's her name? Anne-Marie Melville, his friend during, after Anna Karenina and Wismowski, she was a collaborator with him when he talks about it's the end of narrative in cinema. He's kind of repeating, something in early French modernism there. It's kind of interesting, the end of narrative. And then, of course, the typographical revolution, and this is where some of the fascist aesthetic comes in, of Marinetti. So he has these three things going on. Benjamin was not afraid of the best of the bourgeoisie, or not afraid sometimes of what was going on in fascistic art, right, in a sense. He just didn't deny it. He saw what was there. He tried to study it in some way so that he could, overcome it, or at least point out what's happening. So anyway, then, this story with, the Russian actress, theater person, Lakis, right? He meets her, falls in love, the best kissing of his life. He describes, the long kisses. He goes through all these moments with her in some of his diaries, and he's exposed, if you will, to a very different kind of a Bolshevism, if you will, or a militant Bolshevism. And then he critiques this in 1926 when that the militant communism is suspended, and he says this in 1926. When he's there, right? And of course, he says the only thing that's left is Meyer Hole in the theater, right? That's what he said of this militant communism. So anyway, he starts to write the Arcades project as well during this period, the dialectical scene, right, and dialectics of scene, really. And he characterized it as a dialectical fairy spectacle. That's what he named the Arcades project, a dialectical fairy spectacle. So this is another interesting moment. So the aphoristic, the use of the fairy tale, etc., the use of the childhood memories, etc., all these things coupled with now, and this is why he's very strange amalgamation, right? With a militant Bolshevism that he begins to see being suspended in 1926, right? And he's with this actress in the Soviet Union, and she has a lot of issues. But let me just go back to this the notion of drugs, since we began today with the pharmacon, right? So for hashish, for Benjamin, the power to persuade nature to repeat the great, if you will, wanderings and moments of our existence that we enjoy when we're in love, how we squander our existence when we're in love. This is what he thought hashish did, and he actually would talk about this too in terms of the drug world, that it is very much like the rush switches that happen in jazz improvisation, with his foot. So he thought about this, the dialectical optic, to go to Susan Buck Morse and others who have discussed this, and through my own reading, that he thought that thought was eminently a telepathic powers. This is what happens with hashish. The everyday is impenetrable, the impenetrable every day, and that the critic became involved in this kind of literary struggle between the impenetrable world and the world that is impenetrable. This was always his most important thing. So this hashish was really an opening for him to repeat what he called squandering of our lives, right? The squandering of our lives, that we felt, in love, or we're just out. And this is a surrealist notion too, mad love of a Breton. Of course, Breton, had that relationship. I've been reading his relationship with a Quebec woman in per se, the Archon 17, which is based on the tarot cards, and he plays it out. So I'm sure he was aware of these kind of things. Breton, by the way, was in Gaspésie in Quebec in 1944, 4 years after Benjamin. He spent the last part of the war. He would not go back to Paris until the Germans left completely. He would not go back. So anyway, so Andre Breton, the surrealist, all these factors are coming together. And remember, these are all the cutting edge, if you will, or most of the significant movements of the period. I mean, it's pretty amazing that he's really involved with these, as well as the figures of the movement. Andre Breton had the cafe culture in Paris. After the war, if you've been to Paris, Café Figaro was Andre Breton's headquarters, and Dumago was Jean-Paul Sartre, and the dome was called Levi-Strauss. Right? And then you had a lot of terrorists, so-called, around all three, happening, right? So anyway, so significant friendships begin to develop during this period. In 29, he meets Brecht and Siegfried Kracauer. Yeah, and as most of you know, Kracauer taught Adorno, Kant. There was the Krakow Circle. Very, very important figure. Most of you probably know the great book From Caligari to Hitler on cinema, right? And I want to just say, I think everybody should go back and watch Dr. Mabusa, The Gambler, because that's where we are. I'm thinking if you really want to know where we are, the 30s are before us in a different way, of course, with the Green New Deal. But this is a great masterpiece of Fritz Lang. He had many masterpieces, in my opinion, of that period. But Dr. Mabusa, the Gambler, is an amazing film. Yeah. And remember, it's the underworld that tries M, right? That tries Peter Lorre in the film M. If the court system is completely incompetent, it's only the underworld that can find him and then put him on trial. So a very interesting allegory for Weimar. So anyway, Brecht for him, and this was the relationship, he became a new literary type, a new kind of author, right? He loved the didactic learning plays. He loved this in Brecht. It was a completely new type, right? It was not just aphoristic, fragmented, etc. He loved this kind of notion of learning through the alienation effect, this theater of distantiation, all of these moments that Brecht had, right? So he really loved this about Brecht, right? In a sense. And, and with Krakauer, of course, there was this notion, this friendship about, the filmic world. He learned this. Another person that he met during this period that a lot of people don't read is Siegfried Gideon, Mechanization Takes Control. Very important for a reading of the work of art in the age of Bruno. I have a copy of it. I can show it to you. I have a copy actually here. It's called Mechanization Takes Command. It's a great book on the world of objects and very much along Benjamin's line. He doesn't write much about Gideon, but he mentions him at times through this. Yeah. And then in the 1930s, again, he's back to the literary, André Gide, Louis Aragon, Desnos, the thing. And then he actually did some plays, and this would be a great experiment and something for the radical imagination to do, Josh, is this kind of parody of Heidegger. He and Brecht would sit down and do parodies of Heidegger, confrontation, and the plans to, put Heidegger sort of on trial and at the same time work with him in terms of the German language. So this was going on, and this was in the 1930s, early in the 1930s, right? And then also, speaking of models, the didactic poems, the other model, and remember, the Germans were excellent at this. So for those of you who have read Adorno, critical models is, it has we're really models of thinking, right? Modeled, to be used as, teaching exercises. He came up with this notion of hearing models for the radio programs. So the announcer would present something, but then you would have the counter person saying, critique that. And then they would go on to another level, past the counter argument to something else. And this is the way the program would unfold as a hearing model, right? And in a way, so that you could hear dialectically, right? In some ways, through thesis, antithesis, or argument, counter argument, etc. So this was happening in his radio period, right? So his attempt, what they called the Heidegger School, was to criticize the circumlocutions of the realm of ideas that you see in Heidegger, and to put oneself closer to the coarser and more, if you will, down-to-earth analysis, if you will, or vulgar analysis of what he would juxtapose Franz Mehring as doing that, his friend. And of course, Brecht, because Brecht would always say the proof is in the pudding, or, Brecht was famous for his coarseness, his use of the vernacular, and what he would privilege vulgar Marxism in many ways, and the vulgarity of everyday life. So this was one attempt to kind of, go after Heidegger that they did in the 30s among, this part of this cosmopolitan, I wouldn't call it intelligentsia. I guess good enough to start with. So anyway, this was happening during this period, and the 1930s. And then, of course, maybe I should go now into the approach that he's engaging. He's always reading history from the standpoint of ruination, that we're always in the ruins, right, in a way, in many ways. For those of you that know a little bit about the Benjamin debate with Adorno on this piece, and I'm kind of prefacing it here, Benjamin said that every epoch dreams its successor. And this is a product of consciousness, dream image, et cetera, in a collective consciousness, which imagines utopias to come. Adorno's proposition in the letters to him back were that every epoch dreams that it has been destroyed by catastrophe. So in some ways, this notion of the ruin or the catastrophe, right, that is happening here is much more the starting point that Benjamin ultimately comes to, even though they had this debate about a more, epochal notion of history, right? History as catastrophe, history as part of the ruins, et cetera, versus that of dreaming the successor. Right. And this would be a very interesting thing to think about right now, too. These two moments of historical time. Yeah. Is historical time lead to this catastrophic, right? And, the break from the strophe, again, Aristotle, catachresis, the severance, et cetera. Yeah. Versus that of, that it really is, about its successors, right? Et cetera. The inheritance. Et cetera. But this is, I think, very, very important to think through. So from the standpoint of ruination, let me just say this about Benjamin before we get into the text too. What I primarily like about Benjamin, and I think this is very, very important to keep in mind as we go forward, he was not afraid of reading the best of the bourgeoisie. He was never dismissive. He understood their role. Right. So from his insight was a materialist, conception, which didn't come from the communist brochures or the party lines. Right. That the best bourgeois studies in literary history, should be talked about and not through eternal ideas or timeless values. Right. And the truth is compacted into a historical study. Right, and how you can make this again into a contemporary revealing, contemporary revelation, if you will. So he really wants to read the best books. Two people to me, two authors to me are very crucial for Benjamin. One is Marcel Proust, of course, the image of Proust, and the dialectical image of Proust, and that's worth, again, the great 7 volumes. He has many references to this throughout his output. And of course, Franz Kafka, right? Right, in many ways. That Lukács ultimately said was the realist of our time, after all, the greatest of the social realists, after being in Moscow from, the 30s up until when he went back to Hungary in the late 40s. So anyway, this could be, talked about too. So this is very, very important, to realize. Again, Heidegger never engaged Proust or Kafka, nor Heinrich Mann or Thomas Mann, et cetera, any of these writers. And, going back, it was Hölderlin. The struggle was over Hölderlin, not over Mallarmé and Apollinaire and the surrealists and these kind of other moments. So there's a very different set of, if you will, influences working here, very different anxieties of influence, to use an old phrase there. So anyway, to go on to the text itself, the work of art in the age of, technological reproduction is probably better, or technology reproduction. The term in German really yields the term of technology rather than technique or technics. It's much more closer to technology. It's a technician, that comes out as technological or technology, right? It's not mechanical, right? It's a very bad translation to my mind. Yeah, very bad translation. And I don't know if you have the Harry Zahn translation, but yeah, I have the Hannah Arendt introduction. That's the book I have. I know there are other translations out there, but this is yeah. This is from Illuminations, the one I'm using, Harry Zahn, which was the first book that kind of introduced, if you will, 1968 Benjamin to the American public. And, and again, let me just go back, since Douglas brought up Susan Buck Morris. If you're interested in the Frankfurt School, the history of the Frankfurt School, the first book that really took on the Frankfurt School in the English language and made it present was Martin Jay's book, The Dialectical Imagination. And Martin Jay was a historian in Berkeley. He's a very good friend of my friend, Bob Hewlett-Kenter, who's an Adorno scholar who lives on the Upper West Side. Anyway, is, a good guy. Yeah. And, is very much into Adorno and et cetera. But anyway, all to say, the translation is a problem. It's a real problem. Yeah, in this sense. So, he is doing, like Heidegger, the question concerning technology. He's asking a very materialist question about technology, its reproducibility and its ability to reproduce. So let me begin with just two aspects here. There seem to be two crucial things that run through this text as an introduction to it. First of all, the easy accessibility of postcard representations of great art, right? Illustrations, books, right? Magazines, posters, that you can acquire, you can hold by the hand, you can place them in, one's environment, it can be had by all, right? In a sense, this is what technical or, technological reproducibility allows for, right? And, it's in copy form. And if he's very good about, the printing press, it's the same evolution that the printing press had when it underwent in the earlier century, right? That the printing press really opened up this kind of new way of being able to have accessibility, in a sense, the easy accessibility, number one. And this is something we talk about. We talk about this in school. We never talk about what the curriculum is doing. We talk about accessibility. Everybody has the right to education or to the school. We hardly ever talk about the struggle over curriculum anymore. It's kind of interesting to me. That's been lost in the academic wars and the academic battles. You're getting cancel culture on the other hand, which is not part of curriculum battles. To me, this is, thought police at work in many ways. So anyway, the other aspect is the question of new cultural forms, relatively new cultural forms, and how they play out. Those two cultural forms are obviously film and photography, right? And the new implication for concepts, right? What does it mean to be original? What does it mean to be unique? And if you look at about the there's no originality really in the photography, because the negative is original of its last negative, right? Or what preceded it or what comes after it. So he's looking at this in terms of copy, right? And original, right? In a sense. And the same thing about the film strip as well. The film strip is also an authorization of the unique object. It disappears and then it comes back, right? Et cetera. So he in one way there is a nostalgia, but really when you really read it carefully enough, is there really a nostalgia? This is a question we could have for aura, this auratic notion of the object, the aura itself, right? So he talks about 1900, and Josh, I'll wait for Josh, I guess he'll be back, the photomechanical reproduction of Heidegger, who was a significant, the photographer who had the shift from sentimentalized portraiture to documented spaces of the objective world. Heidegger was a major figure in the history of photography. Sean, you know anything about Heidegger and what his role was? Yeah, Sean, yeah, you there?
Okay. Well, he was a photographer who basically started making photographs of old Paris in the 1870s, 80s, and up to the early 1920s.
Right.
And he primarily took photographs and sold them to artists and to museums.
Right,
of old Paris in transition
right,
to the more modern Paris.
right, right. No,
And he
good. Yeah, go ahead, please. Yeah,
Well, Bernice Abbott, who collected his work and so sort of protected it over the years, it became very important. He took on a major. He's considered very important amongst photographers of that era. And
Benjamin marks him as getting away from portraiture, use of
Right.
photography as portraiture or peopled, photography, which you don't do yourself, right, as a
No.
photographer.
buildings.
Yeah. We had buildings and spaces, and as you said,
Yes,
yeah.
So that's the kind of work that he got involved with.
And he called this photo, Benjamin calls this a kind of photo mechanical reproduction of the world of objects. He uses this term, right? Yeah. So anyway, we'll go back to this, but I'd get it as a major figure for him in terms of the photographic image. Yeah. And how it's transformed. All right. So but go ahead, Sean. You have some more to say about it?
Well, I think I'm not sure. My knowledge about Benjamin and actually I'm not that strong on, but as a photographer, he people like John Sarkowski of the Museum of Modern Art also took him on and made put together 4 major volumes of his work. So yes, very significant.
Okay, good. Okay, so at least I got the right proper name. Yeah. Good. Okay, good. All right. So So anyway, he wants to talk about this as well. That he wants to also juxtapose. I mean, remember, accessibility, uniqueness, and copy and original are the 2 major threads that run through this, I think, in many ways. And Benny also, one thing that's very interesting about this essay is how the use of counter-revolutionaries, how good they are at the use of best use of modern media, right? And, and anyway, how the film itself, and I think he points to this as well, and you can glean it from the reading and also some of the other things he did, is the erratic, charismatic glow of Hitler, right? How this was done by the Nazi cinematographers. It's pretty amazing when you really think about this. And in some ways, advertising, which we don't really study today because we don't really watch TV, or we turn off the ads so quickly because of the internet now. Don't give me this pop-up. But advertising in some ways has mastered this kind of Russian formalism, symbolism, futurism, etc., in terms of selling projects and products. And one person obviously is Bernays, in terms of, the beginning of propaganda, Freud's nephew, renowned nephew that he kind of disnephewed later on. But, this kind of use of the charismatic glow of something, this use of selling something, etc. So this is very important to remember that, these 2 new, moments, the photography and film, how they're used by modern media so effectively, right, in some ways. And also the use of the close-up by the Nazis, in a sense that they obviously left some distance. And we can go into this as well about the use of this for the masses. So anyway, Benjamin is not writing, with all due respect to Peter Berger and others, he's not writing an avant-garde manifesto here, right? Yeah, it's not an avant-garde manifesto. He's really interested in these notions of original copy and also the political use of art, right? In a way, how can this be used? Film and photography and this way, right? So, and this is going on obviously in the epilogue, right? That it's interesting that the fascist principle is always masses come to their expression, but never to their rights in the arts. This is a good working proposition, I think. They come to their expression, and you think about what Adorno was criticizing in German expressionism, too. The George Groats, et cetera, et cetera. Very interesting when you begin to see these divides. And then in a sense, they would leave an imprint of their presence, but they were never present, the masses too. This is another interesting aspect, I think, that that we could talk about, right? Yeah, it was always represented formally, right? But never politically, right? Yeah, always represented in a formal sense, in an imaging sense, but never really as political subjects, right? Very interesting. And this kind of depoliticization of the masses that the fascist regimes were so good at, right? In some ways, yeah. I mean, of course, mobilizing, no problem doing that, but that's because of, in a sense, they can have their expression, right, in the uniform. The Kyle Rittenhouse, in a sense, if you want to think about this in contemporary terms, can have his day as expression, but no such thing as rights, right? It's not a fight for rights, right, in a sense. It's kind of interesting when you really think about it. He won't have a present, but he won't have, yeah, please, go ahead, yeah.
Can I ask a quick question? I want to get your take on something.
Sure.
And it's not like, it's a small part of the text, but it just kind of struck me.
Sure.
It was on page 227. He refers to Abel Gance, the French
great filmmaker,
director.
French director, yeah.
And he seems to be critiquing Gance as a symptom or an exemplar of directors who relied upon earlier modes of theories about film that needed to be superseded, or at least that's how it seems to me. And it reminds me that I would recommend everybody, if they haven't watched it, it's an amazing movie. It's called Napoleon, and it's this 4-hour, you've seen it. So it's a 4-hour movie, which I think was so kind of illustrative, or maybe what embodies the film is that he portrays Napoleon as a born leader somehow. There's a snow fight in the beginning of the movie, right, in which Napoleon already manifests himself as some sort of, there's a trajectory almost of this Hegelian trajectory of the great man emerging. So I just wanted to get your take on, when he's critiquing Gance, do you think he's critiquing something about
I think he's critiquing this charismatic glow that he sees later in the Riefenstahls and others too.
Right.
Although Gance does this with Napoleon, etc. So it's this elevation of the figure, right, in some ways, to this charismatic moment, right? And it becomes almost propagandistic in some ways. So he's criticizing that. And I think he takes on Gance from the point of view of on the notion, the film and hieroglyphics, right? If I'm not mistaken. Yeah. So he wants to, by a reasonable regression, we have come back to the level of expression of the Egyptians. And he sees this very pictorial language has not matured because our eyes have not adjusted to it yet. There is a yet insufficient respect for, insufficient cult of what it expresses. And that's Abel Gance, right? Speaking.
Yeah, I think so.
So in the words, what art has been granted a dream, more political and more real at the same time. So he goes on about this, but to go on the fantasy with the question, do not all bold descriptions we have been given amount to the definition of prayer? So in some ways, he's looking at this, the use of this kind of almost hagiographic pictorial language in cinema, right? Mm-hmm. Abel Gance is a great director of. I recommend seeing Napoleon. I mean, it's a great film. It's a classic in terms of the history of cinema. And anyway, he says, this, however, he says these speculations were built like public opinion and the gold rush had already appeared. Right, so he goes on to the Chaplin-esque, which he loves, right? And he says, this, however, did not keep Gance from adducing, hieroglyphics for purposes of comparison, nor Severine Mars from speaking of the film what might speak of paintings by Fra Angelico. Characteristically, even today, ultra-reactionary authors give the film a similar contextual significance, if not an outright sacred one, then at least a supernatural one. And then Rex Reinhardt's film version of A Midnight Summer's Dream. And Reinhardt was the great for those of you who don't know, was the great theatrical director of the Brechtian plays, right? He was a great theatrical director. Werfel states that Undella was a sterile copying of the exterior world with its streets, interiors, railroad stations, restaurants, motor cars, and beaches, which now had obstructed the elevation of the film to the realm of art. The film had not yet realized its real meaning, its real possibilities. These consist in its unique faculty expressed by natural means and with incomparable persuasiveness of all that is fairy-like, marvelous, and supernatural. So, so anyway, again, I mean, he's really looking at this ability of film, not only to deceive, but to really present these, almost, heavenly ecstasies, right, of this hagiographic approach, right, to figures in history and events in history, right? And, this is a far cry from Eisenstein's October 1917,
Right.
or Gilo Pontecorva's Burn later on, right, in many ways. You're not going to get that, right, in a sense. So, yeah. So again, he's looking at this too. Remember, it's always political going on. But again, you've got me going, because I'm going to probably stay up late tonight and watch Napoleon again, or at least
it's a 4-hour movie.
Okay,
but,
yeah, I know. Yeah.
But yes, the aura.
Malcolm X used to say, "Who has time for sleep?" Yeah. Anyway, do that when you're dead. Anyway, but anyway, so. Yeah, so no, good point. I mean, I recommend Abel Gance. There's been some very good studies of Gance on this too. I can't remember. I know that our friend Dan Georgiakis wrote something for Cineast about him in a way. So and so let's go back just for a second to, I just wanted to say this too, that he is always, if you will, Benjamin is, trying to subvert. I mean, it's a very subversive thinker, in a way. He's looking at the reactionary uses of the close-up, and you just pointed that out in Abel Gance. You never see that in a leader in Godard, for example, or you never see in a Wim Wenders film, some of our own contemporaries, right? You never see this kind of, close-up on the figure, this kind of erratic, moment, right? So he's really looking at this very well. And I also advise, since I guess people read Deleuze in this crowd, the notion of the close-up, and Antonioni in his book on movement image, his study of film. He has a 2-volume study on movement image in his book on cinema. So anyway, so I mean, maybe we can just go to the text for a while. I mean, any questions or remarks? Again, I would like to work with these threads of if you will, of the moments here of the accessibility, and also the new cultural forms. The two things here that are crucial are obviously photography and film as we go forward, because they have revolutionary value. What did Godard say? Every person should have a movie camera, and he's playing on, obviously the Ziga Vertov group, the man with a movie camera, in 1929. So anyway, so maybe we can go through this.
Can I ask a question, or just sort of, I mean, in a very general way, particularly compared to Heidegger, I mean, Benjamin doesn't seem to be mourning the loss of the aura, or this tradition at all.
No.
But I was a little confused in some ways about the way he seems to be, talk about, and maybe some of it's just language, but this maybe is a little later than where you want to start, but sections 10 through 12.
Yeah, we didn't sign those for tonight, but what are you going to want to say about it? Yeah.
I guess
Yeah. No, it's okay.
Well, it's interesting because, like, he's talking about the loss of the aura, and then how the film industry responds by, the creation of the spectacle, and the personality, right, which we still live very much within that era. And then he talks about, this democratization. And so he doesn't use that word, but it's sort of like everyone becomes a writer, everyone can become an image producer now. And I thought that was very interesting, given social media and where we've gotten to now, which, right, it's like, everyone can produce their own movie. And but then he sort of, I didn't, I guess, understand really some of the implications he's drawing out of it, because
Okay, maybe we can go there after we read it for next week, but
okay,
yeah, I mean, it's a good section to go on because he is speaking about film and the erratic there as well as, yeah, and it's used for and the epilogue, we'd be able to tie that into the epilogue because that's where he's going to actually begin the program, if you will. Yeah. So anyway, I just wanted to mention again, the thesis on the philosophy of history, which is also in this book. Number 9 is the famous one on Paul Klee, the beginning of the.
Michael, you got muted somehow.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Going back to this section 9 of the thesis on the philosophy of history, which is in this book. He cites Sholem on Angelus Novus. My wing is ready for flight. I would like to turn back. If I stayed timeless time, I would have little luck. Anyway, a clay painting named Angelus Novus shows us an angel looking as though he is about to move away from something he is fixedly contemplating. His eyes are staring, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. This is how one pictures the angel of history. His face is turned towards the past. Where we perceive a chain of events, he sees a single catastrophe. You can hear the Adorno at work here, which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with so much violence, such violence that the angel can no longer close them. This storm irresistibly propels him into the future, to which his back is turned, while the pole of debris before him grows skyward. The storm is what we call progress. So I think this is a very important, if you will, kind of epigram to read, in the light of, what he really wants to do with photography, film, and other, art forms in this, the work of art, the work that art does in the age of technological reproduction. So I'll put that out there as an epigraph where we can return to, this past that becomes almost frozen, right? The catastrophe. Is there such a thing as progress, right? What do we call progress, etc. Right? Yeah. So anyway, okay. Yeah, there. Thank you, Matt. Yeah, there is a good article, and yeah. Thank you. Okay, so let's go back. He begins with Paul Ballaray's notebooks on the arts in the beginning. And he talks about the fine arts, right, here, the pieces, the conquest of ubiquity, right? Our fine arts were developed, their types and uses were established in times very different from the present by men whose power of action upon things was insignificant in comparison with ours. But the amazing growth of our techniques, the adaptability and precision they have attained, the ideas and habits they are creating, make it a certainty that profound changes are impending in the ancient crafts of the beautiful. In all the arts, there's a physical component which can no longer be considered or treated as it used to be, which cannot remain unaffected by our modern knowledge and power. For the last 20 years, neither matter nor space nor time has been what it was from time immemorial, right? We must expect great innovations to transform the entire technique of the arts, thereby affecting artistic invention itself, and perhaps even bringing about an amazing change in our very notion of art. Right? So he's going to begin with this as his epigraph, very interestingly enough, about this massive change that happens with this new technological reproduction, right? What is happening outside of, yeah, the painting on the walls, the bronze and crafts, the work of the hand. All of these things are, being put into that. So he's going to begin there. By the way, Paul Valery, an interesting character if you've never read him. Just a side remark here. T.S. Eliot said of him, he was so smart, he had no ambition at all. And, it reminds me of Bob Dylan, to understand too soon. There's no point in really trying. So anyway, this is a very interesting notion of the ambition and et cetera that goes forward. Okay, so the preface. And Benjamin's very careful here. This is very beautiful. When Marx, of course, he's going to open up with the authority, right, undertook his critique of the capitalist mode of production, this mode was in its infancy, in a way. So in a sense, he's very good at this, right? The infancy of industrial capital, industrial-technical capital. Marx directed his efforts in such a way as to give them prognostic value. He went back to the basic conditions underlying capitalist production, and through this presentation, his presentation showed what be expected of capitalism in the future. The result was one could expected not only to exploit the proletariat, right, with increasing intensity, but ultimately to create conditions which would make it possible to abolish capitalism itself. So this is a rereading, obviously, of the manifesto and volume 1 of Capital very early on. The transformation, and notice the language here again, of the superstructure, which takes place far more slowly than that of the substructure, has taken more than a half a century to manifest in all areas of culture the change in the conditions of production. So he's going to really see this as a revolution, in form and etc. Only today can it be indicated what form this has taken. Certain prognostic requirements should be met by these statements. However, theses about the art of the proletariat after his assumption of power, or about the art of a classless society, would have less bearing on these demands than theses about the developmental tendencies of art under present conditions of production. So he wants to, really put himself in the moment. There's no question about this, in my sense. So Benjamin, going back to the past or doing some kind of predictive value, this is not his intention. It is to look at the present and what the new forms are doing, right? Their dialectic is no less noticeable, in the superstructure than in the economy. It would therefore be wrong to underestimate the value of such theses as a weapon. They brush aside a number of outmoded concepts, such as creativity and genius, eternal value and mystery concepts whose uncontrolled and at present almost uncontrollable application would lead us to a processing of data in the fascist sense. The concepts which are introduced into the theory of art in what follows differ from the more familiar terms in that they are completely useless for the purpose of fascism. It's very interesting how careful he's going to be here. This is a 1935 essay, by the way. This is when it's written. They are, on the other hand, useful for the formulation of revolutionary demands in the politics of art. So right now, we're going to get, obviously, a proposal, if you will, a prospectus for, the revolutionary use of art, right? And its revolutionary potential. And at the same time, we're going to be very careful that it doesn't regress, right, into fascistic usage and use value, right, et cetera. Cannot be, again, co-opted, right, in many ways. So this is very important to look at this. Also, that, it's time for Marxists to get out of the 19th century, right, and kind of think about this in terms of at least the early 20th century and these shifts, right, in many ways, right, so many ways. Yeah. All right. So this is very, very important to keep in mind. So it's a very beautiful preface, the saying beforehand. My intention here, obviously, Benjamin is saying, my intention here is to make sure, right, this cannot be co-opted by the fascists, right, in a way. One of the reasons he's taking on Abel Gance, right, when, in a sense, right? He has this in mind, right? How this could be used by, fascistic, the cult of the leader, the presentation of the leader, et cetera, et cetera. The Führer principle, the Napoleonic complex, all of these things. Yeah, going on, right? Yeah, okay. So very well aware of this. Okay, so let's look at this. I mean, he's very careful. In principle, right? The arche, the work of art has always been reproducible. He goes through a little, elementary history here. Man-made artifacts could always be imitated by men. Replicas were made by pupils in practice of their craft, by masters for diffusing their works, and finally by third parties in the pursuit of gain. Mechanical reproduction of a work of art, however, represents something new. Historically, it advanced intermittently and in leaps at long intervals, but with accelerated intensity. And this is very important, right? The accelerated intensity. The difference between Benjamin and Vladimir Lenin, one believes in the locomotive of history, right? And class struggle as the motor of history. They have that in common, but the locomotive of history versus that of pulling the emergency brake on the train, on that locomotive. That's the major difference between, the militant materialism, if you will, of Vladimir Lenin and Walter Benjamin, who is much more careful, in my opinion, in looking at this idea of progress and what will happen. Yeah, anyway, we can talk more about that. The Greeks only knew two procedures of technically reproducing works of art: founding and stamping. Bronzes, terracottas, and coins were the only art works which they could produce in quantity. All others were unique and could not be mechanically reproduced or technically reproduced. With the woodcut, graphic art becomes technically reproducible for the first time, long before script became reproducible by print. And Benjamin has a very, very long history also looking at the glyph and the print and the word itself and handwriting. He did a lot of work on handwriting earlier on too, yeah, in terms of analyzing the mark on the page, right, in the sense, and how it's done. The enormous changes which printing, the technical reproduction of writing, has brought about in literature are a familiar story. However, within the phenomena which we are examining here from the perspective of world history, print is merely a special, though particularly important case. During the Middle Ages, engraving and etching were added to the woodcut. At the beginning of the 19th century, lithography made its appearance. With lithography, the technique of reproduction reached an essentially new stage. This more direct process was distinguished by the tracing of the design on the stone rather than in its incision on a block of wood. Yeah, so we get the trace, right? Or it's etching on a copper plate and permitting graphic art for the first time to put its products on the market, not only in large numbers as hitherto, but also in daily changing forms. Lithography enabled graphic art to illustrate everyday life. Hence, the accessibility of the masses. Again, illustrations, as I mentioned, is a crucial, aspect of this. By only a few decades after its invention, lithography was surpassed by photography. For the first time in the process of pictorial reproduction, photography freed the hand of the most important artistic functions which henceforth devolved only upon the eye looking into a lens. Anyways, since the eye perceives more swiftly than the hand can draw, the process of pictorial reproduction was accelerated so enormously that it could keep pace with speech. A film operator shooting a scene in the studio captures the images at the speed of an actor's speech. Just as lithography virtually implied the illustrated newspaper, so did photography foreshadow the sound film. Very interesting. By the way, the talkies came right on the market at the right time during the Depression. There were no, 1920 now, we're still in silent films, but boy, the talkies made the appearance, right? In a sense. And then, of course, we had the talking cure that becomes very developed in the United States with ego psychology. It's very interesting to trace these things, not only, historically, but through their forms and their effects in the social, right? Okay, just as lithography inspired the illustrated, photography foreshadowed the sound film. The technical reproduction, of sound was tackled at the end of the last century. These convergent endeavors made predictable a situation which Valery pointed out in this sentence, and he's obviously reading pieces of art very carefully. Just as water, gas, electricity are brought into our houses from far off to satisfy our needs in response to a minimal effort, so we will be supplied with visual or auditory images, which will appear and disappear at a single movement of the hand, hardly more than a sign. Yep, smart man. Around 1900, technical reproduction had reached a standard that not only permitted it to reproduce, interesting, all transmitted works of art, and thus to cause the most profound change in their impact upon the public, and it also captured a place of its own among the artistic processes. For the study of this standard, nothing is more revealing than the nature of the repercussions that these two different manifestations, one, the reproductions of the work of art, and the art of the film, have had on art in its traditional form. So, okay, so again, setting the stage here, very important. But there's obviously this great break that he's talking about, right? This rupture. If you think of revolution, I like to think of the word revolution as a rupture, in a way. This is a rupture, in terms of reproducibility and something new. Okay, so anyway, number two, the question of the original and the copy. In section 2, even the most perfect reproduction of a work of art is lacking in one element: its presence in time and space, its unique existence at the place where it happens to be. This unique existence of the work of art determined the history to which it was subject throughout the time of its existence. This includes the changes which it may have suffered in physical condition over the years, as well as the various changes in its ownership. John was talking about the role of Bernice Abbott with Atgut, how this was very much a protection, right? And really was a very much a protection of the work. Right? The traces of the first can be revealed only by chemical or physical analysis, which is impossible to perform on a reproduction. Changes of ownership are subject to a tradition which must be traced from the situation of the original. By the way, Walter Benjamin was a collector. He wrote a very beautiful essay called Unpacking My Library. And, he really was the art of collection, in many ways, right? Very, very good at collecting objects, and he got this from his childhood. This was really his notion. So anyway, let's go back to this. The present of the original is the prerequisite to the concept of authenticity. And again, this goes back to the genuineness and non-genuineness of the work of art that I mentioned a little earlier tonight. Okay, so chemical analysis of the patina of a bronze can help establish this. So he goes through all these technical means, as does proof that a given manuscript of the Middle Ages stems from an archive of the 15th century. When I was at Johns Hopkins many moons ago, there was a person in the philosophy department. We used to talk about this. We should write Aristotle's theory of comedy in ancient Greek and have it discovered, somewhere on the Aegean coastline. We used to think about things like this, to do. So kind of funny, that he's thinking this way. The whole sphere of authenticity is outside technical, and this is interesting, is outside, and of course, not only technical reproducibility. Confronted with its manual reproduction, which was usually branded as a forgery, the original preserved all its authority. Not so vis-a-vis technical reproduction. The reason is twofold. And this is crucial. First, process reproduction is more independent of the original film than manual reproduction. For example, in photography, process reproduction can bring out those aspects of the original, right, that are unattainable to the naked eye, yet accessible to the lens, which is adjustable and chooses its angle at will. And photographic reproduction with the aid of certain processes such as enlargement, slow motion, can capture images which escape natural vision. Secondly, technical reproduction can put the copy of the original into situations which would be out of reach for the original itself. Above all, it enables the original to meet the beholder halfway, be it in the form of a photograph or a phonographic record, which are making a big comeback right now. The cathedral leaves, right, its locale to be received in the studio of a lover of art. The choral production performed in the auditorium or in the open air resounds in the drawing room. So this is, again, very, very important here. Our friend Arto, who watches us sometimes on YouTube's not here because he's in a different country and it's about 4 a.m. But anyway, you know, he has this aura with the old vinyl now. Michael, it's great. I go to the turntable. I mean, it's a process. I can hear the groove, all this stuff. The return of vinyl, this auratic that is going on, and you know, in this reproducibility. Is Benjamin really speaking to this in terms of the aura? Well, yes and no. Yeah, we'll go back there in a second.
Yeah,
Carl, yeah, go ahead. Yeah,
no,
yeah.
I just that's an interesting, you know, point, is that how,
Right.
you know, auras can be rediscovered or reinvented or
Yes. Well, is aura a reproducibility? Is it being reduplicated is the question. You know, what is unique? What is original versus that of the copy? Is this a copy of the auratic, you know, in a certain way? You know? Yeah. You hear what I mean? You know, this is where, you know, Benjamin kind of wants to go, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, this is, you know, just to share, you know, when I was reading this, when you were reading this right now, I was thinking about one of the most awe-inspiring experiences I've ever had looking at, quote, a work of art in a museum, was seeing this picture of Trotsky giving an address to some Congress. And I had read about it, but it was the first time I had seen it, right?
Right.
And it was just absolutely captivating to me. I just stood in front of it. It was like, wow, you know, I felt like I could almost enter into the real moment. But if I had first seen it and then read about it, it would probably not have had that effect. It's interesting how the
Yes,
temporality.
that's interesting in that way, and you should hold that as we go through this essay. That's a very good, experiential, moment in terms of, you know, the copy and the original, the auratic and the non-auratic, and you know, is the aura itself reproducible? In my friend's case, he's talking to me about what was he listening to? It was Coltrane and Elvin Jones versus that of the earlier stuff, you know, going on in terms of a kind of duet on the one on the drum and of course the sax. And he was going on about that, and then about Ornette Coleman. He had some things. Sam Rivers. He was going to Sam Rivers of the new jazz. I don't know if you know these names, but Sam Rivers is a major player of the new music and you know of this period. So he's saying, I've never heard it so well. You know, he's going on. I mean, it was like a magical thing to put the photograph, you know, the vinyl on the turntable, etc. You know, and yeah. So anyway, I mean, it's kind of interesting that this kind of experiences, but how commodified they're going to be. See, this is another question we have to ask here. How does this commodification of the experiential happen? You know, what is really going on here? You know, is the book going to become something like this in the future? You know, 50 years from now, 75 years from now, the hard copy, right? This notion that is slowly going, you know, in the electronic ether world. Yeah, Patrick, you wanted to say something?
No, I just would point. I mean, the obvious thing is that these are all reproductions of an original performance.
Absolutely.
And to me, it's like the reproductions, you can make it into a fetish, because for me, the authentic one is really the actual experience of going to a performance.
Yes.
And
so I agree with you. Yes, there are phenomena would be to see this live, be there, you know, et cetera. You know, one of the great jazz moments I had, Aronowitz and I sat about 10 feet from Cecil Taylor doing a concert at the Blue Note, about 15 years ago, number one. We also sat there with Abby Lincoln performing too. So you're not going to get the same level. You're not going to see it. You're not going to hear it the same way, etc. I agree with you about the live, yeah. I mean, it can be remastered to make your ears better, but there's something about that primordial experience. And that's what Benjamin really wants to go to, this phenomena, right? I mean, this is always his search, and not in a nostalgic way. I don't think he's nostalgic. A lot of people have talked about this as nostalgia, and that's a loaded concept too, because nostos always also means a return home. Right? That's what nostos really means. To the Greeks, the Odyssey was the return home. There's a great proposition about the Odyssey. Circe offered Odysseus immortality or a return home, and he chose the latter, right? Very interesting in a sense. That was the beginning of nostos in the ancient Greek. So
It's
anyway.
just to keep riffing on this a little bit.
Yeah, no problem.
What's interesting is that I play music, and I at one point studied it pretty earnestly, and jazz, and that one of the things that the phonograph, or particularly the CD now, makes possible though is in the jazz tradition was the artifact of the performance allowed you to go back and analyze and study and copy the performance. That's how all the great jazz musicians at one point used to learn their craft, was copying off of records. I took lessons with Joe Henderson, and he described to me how I just
You play the sax?
yeah back then. Now I play drums, but
Okay.
he described how he didn't have books at that time. They just like played together. They went out, and then they just sat at home and just copied and copied and copied and copied, and just learned off of the record. But it was a different kind of analytical process because you could break it up
Yeah.
and repeat it, right? Which has now become much more sophisticated with the CD and
Sure.
But it's interesting. It almost makes the improvised performance, which is singular, into a book-like form, which you can take apart and analyze and cut
Yeah,
out.
no, it's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've noticed this with my friend, pianist here, that one time I had this Duke Ellington, and I think it was what was the name? I think that All the Things You Are did a kind of version of it. She kept going back to one particular point about 9 times on the CD to hear it in a different way, to put it in a kind of register. So I kind of understand this in a way. I mean, this is someone that performs, and very interesting the way you speak about this in some ways. I mean, our friend Arto, in a way, was also Sam Rivers, what a great experience, et cetera, et cetera. But I agree with Patrick, there's nothing better than the live in terms of really there, because it's the overwhelmingness. You're right, Carl. I think it's really the ability for us to be kind of overwhelmed, overtaken by something that we don't really leave ourselves vulnerable to that anymore, because everything is, the objects are all there. We can reach for them in a sense. So we don't really have this, this overwhelmingness, this kind of, really, primary experience anymore. That he's really trying to get to this erfahrung, in many ways. This travel. What erfahrung really means is handed down experience. It has a relationship to Aristotelian, experience as phronesis, practical wisdom. It's handed down wisdom, and it's part of this really deep understanding of what experience is, rather than the lived everyday, the erlebnis, which is surface, which is basically what the internet does. This whole new culture of this technological reproduction that we're living through, this kind of screen new deal, this new the new technologies, etc. It has many, I guess. I mean, it'd be interesting to take a Benjaminian approach to this now, vis-a-vis experience. What is the level of experience with something as, quote, possibly democratic as the internet? or that's how it was, built up to be in the beginning, right? That the
Professor
new
Pires?
yeah, please, yeah. Call me
I would-
Michael.
Oh, Michael, okay.
Please,
Okay, well,
Yeah.
I was going to bring this up later, but since you
Yeah.
raised this idea of this issue, one of the things that I've always been struck by, and I think my teacher was the one to really raise it, not me, so I have to give him credit for this insight, is here you have this work of art in the mechanical reproduction, which is exploding the traditional idea of art and creating something that has revolutionary potential with the mass of people in the audience as a group emerging from this experience, the spectacle, and destroying the concept of aura. And yet in another essay, which is in this book, Illuminations, written around the same time, I believe, The Storyteller,
Yes.
he advocates a almost diametrically opposite idea that seems to preserve aura. And I just want to raise it up to demonstrate my own feeling. And I think that it's very hard to find it programmatic, Benjamin. And when we approach these texts, we need to be, I think, cautious that he's not advocating, you said it earlier, Peter Berger, this is not an aesthetic manifesto or even a political manifesto, but some of the works like Critique of Violence do approach a kind of very programmatic. And I was wondering to what extent that might be his grappling, because he had to satisfy Adorno, and he was actually dependent on Adorno, I believe, for financial assistance at some points. Do you think there was partly a desire to try to placate Adorno in some way in that?
In terms of, in what sense? About going beyond the aura, or?
Well, just in general, Adorno critiqued him for being insufficiently dialectical. And I know that Adorno was kind of in France when Benjamin had no money. I believe he was sustaining him financially, literally. So I'm just wondering, do you think that, to what extent, I guess the question is, can we say Benjamin truly believes in the idea of film as revolutionary, as opposed to, and the idea of destroying the aura? That's a kind of larger question I'm wondering about.
Yeah, I think we should, hold that, because, Adorno worked, for people that don't know, with Hans Eisler, Transparency on Film, right? Then Adorno had a very active part in terms of Hollywood in some ways through Eisler and others. He knew Weil as well, and Weil was very important to Brecht, and all of these people were in, you quote, the entertainment industry, and this was not just restricted to the proper names we deal with here, as you know, Hollywood, the music industry, the film industry in particular was filled with refugees and very subversive people, including Peter Lorre and Bela Lugosi, right, who were basically communists, right, in many ways. So I think it's important to remember the milieu in which they're operating too. But yeah, you raised a good question. I'm not so sure Adorno would advance the thesis that film becomes the art form of the masses, or every man with a movie camera.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not really sure that Adorno would go that way. Whereas the epilogue here, I think the letters exchanged, and these are very complicated. I think what he's really trying to do is again, Adorno wants to go back to this notion of a catastrophe, this thinking of catastrophe. Benjamin seems to want to both deal with catastrophe, but also hurl us like Angelus Novus into the future, even though the wings are, together, right? So,
and we didn't get into, I didn't mean to throw in Adorno.
no,
It
it's
just
okay. It's all right.
what interests me, and we didn't assign it, you didn't assign it, which is the storyteller, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. But
It's okay, you can mention it. It's no problem. Yeah.
you mentioned something pertaining to the idea of passing on. And that's what the storyteller is about, is this singular storyteller like Leskov, who transmits something from one generation to the other and creates this kind of uniqueness. And in one way, you could interpret that as Benjamin's actually kind of in that essay praising aura in a way, whereas in this essay he's kind of destroying aura. So it's a strange opposition there, and I don't want to suggest he's being contradictory. I don't think that's Benjamin's interest, but these two need to be, I wouldn't say we try to reconcile them. I just think they're slightly different in the way they focus on art. and stories.
Right, right. No, I mean, that's a good point, and I did make that distinction about the narrative too, right?
Yeah.
That he wants to eliminate narrative, but with Leskov and the storyteller, and the task of the storyteller is this kind of recapturing, if you will. I mean, remember, Benjamin is very close. I mean, the essay here is really Benjamin and Proust, right? Proust's remembrance of things past is a great testament to memory, time, will, and in so many ways. I mean, it's a magnificent, approach. 7 volumes written in a cork-lined room, by an asthmatic who died, in his 40s too. And anyway, all to say, and then the nephew of Henri Bergson, probably the most important, French Jewish philosopher of the 20th century, and and I guess most of he came to Broadway, and nearly, I think, 250,000 people came out to see Bergson. You can't get philosophers to get 30 people in a class these days unless they're forced, much less 250,000 people. Sartre's funeral was attended by 500,000 in Paris, to give you an idea. And that was only 50 years ago, 40 something years ago.
Yeah.
41 years ago to be exact, in April of 1980. But anyway, no, you raised a very good point. I mean, I think Benjamin has, again, dialectics, if you will, does not resolve all the contradictions.
Right.
We're not getting the absolute here, and you can still see the contradictions. I think he's very far ranging. And remember, the choice of thinkers for an Adorno, when he writes the aesthetic theory, which is after this, he's working on it. But, aesthetic theory, the main character, the main thinker there is Samuel Beckett. Yeah, for Adorno. And you talk about catastrophe and contradiction together. You see that, I'll go on, I can't go on, I'll go on, right? And, Adorno loved Beckett, and they had actually a lot of correspondence, which is, hasn't been really written about much, but they were in correspondence. He really loved Samuel Beckett. So Benjamin did not know Beckett, because 1940, Beckett is driving an ambulance, during the resistance, or the beginnings of the resistance. And Benjamin, is in the period, trying to cross into Spain, right? And, so with the suitcase. So no, I mean, you raise very good points. So this is a person that's, and I don't really think we should type him one way. And I think that's good, what you raise here, By the way, Adorno did not, I mean, he sent money, but it was really through the Institute that he sent money. It was not, really, it was not an Engels-Marx relationship.
It was work. It was work that was done, and he paid for jerk. It wasn't charity. I understand.
Yeah. Adorno wasn't the nicest man, from what I know these things either. So anyway, old Teddy. Yeah. So anyway, and you notice that Benjamin does not have I mean, remember, Adorno is also coming out of Schoenberg and of course Anton Webern, during this period, and Benjamin does not really go there, the revolution in music, right? in a way, to any extent. Whereas Adorno wrote, I think, close to 8 or 9 studies on music, Mahler, Beethoven, so many, he wrote a book on Berg, he wrote Philosophy of New Music, so there's a very different set of aesthetic object, if you will, or form, forms in some ways. Yeah. So we can go back to that. But yeah, let's go on a little bit. But this was good. I mean, this notion of the aura and the sphere of authenticity, really, because again, this is this drive, if you will, during this period in Heidegger's sense, through the authenticity, the Eigenlichkeit, right, in a way that making proper to one's own is part of what's going on, that is picked up, as an authenticity of self, or self-standingness, whereas the authenticity for Benjamin is in the artwork, right, itself. What's authentic. And I want to mention a movie. I know I do this a lot, but it would be a very good class. The American Friend, if you remember that, some of you, Wim Wenders. It's with Bruno Ganz. And, and then he cast 7 movie directors, including Nick Ray, who plays the artist, who's a master copyist. You can't tell the original from the forgery. And this raises real questions. This it was very good because that really, in a way, that film is about the Gestalt. If I was to say one film that represents Heidegger's notion of Gestalt, right? The framer who's set up, right, to, make sure he authenticates a copy. He's able to detect in the framing. Bruno Ganz, who's sick, is set up, is framed up, the framer, and then the frames of the original and the copy going throughout this, the whole culture of the auction. It's a very impressive movie. I think 70, late 70s, I think was when it first came out. Yeah. But anyway, really thought about during this time. And I think this essay was out there then too, as part of this, the American Friend by Wim Wenders. He cast 7 different directors, and he actually reoriented, got Dennis Hopper out of the hopper, so to speak, and got his career going again after a long malaise. Dennis Hopper. It's based on a novelist who I also recommend, who's incredibly good, Patricia Highsmith. Speaking of narrative and the novel, it's on Ripley's Game.
Yeah.
Is the background to this. And of course, this stupid, excuse me, Josh isn't part of it, but anyway, this generation of people, Matt Damon remakes Ripley's Game, can you imagine, after the American Friend. So, that's an example of, complete, fascist use of art, right, in some ways, and we can talk about that, yeah. I just learned that, by the way, Francis Ford Coppola and George Lucas both were talking about, they were reading Capital when The Godfather and Star Wars were made. Kind of interesting. They were reading Marx and having long discussions about this. So it goes to show you in some ways, this remnant of Hollywood in the 30s is still going on. Yeah.
Can I mention one more movie?
Yeah, sure, of course.
There's, I think it's Fritz Lang in the 60s.
Right.
Wait. Not Fritz, was starred in, I believe he stars in a movie by Godard about the remaking of the Odyssey.
Contempt.
Contempt, exactly.
Jack Palance and Fritz Lang.
No, it's a brilliant
Bridget
movie, and
Bardot.
it also what?
Bridget Bardot is in Contempt.
Yeah, it's a brilliant film, and it also rises these questions, the parody of the American, and also of the love affair, which is doomed. It's just brilliant. Takeaway.
No, I agree with you. It's a film very unrepresented in Godard studies. It's taken up by some, but Lang is in that. He loved Fritz Lang. Fritz Lang was, the greatest of the German filmmakers in my opinion. They were all good. Von Stroheim, von Stern, all of them. But Lang to me was the great one. But anyway, okay. So let's look at this in authenticity, and I won't keep you forever tonight. But anyway, we can go back to this. This was I think, a very good introduction, and there's obviously a lot of background here. The situations, I'm reading from page 221 now. Oh, I think I'm too far. Oh no, I'm sorry. I flipped to the Abel Gance for some reason. Okay, so going back about reproducibility and the I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong okay, so yes, one might the situations, this is number 2 on page 221, into which the product of mechanical reproduction or technical can be brought may not touch the actual work of art, yet the quality of its presence is always depreciated. This holds not only for the artwork, but also, for instance, for a landscape, which passes in review before the spectator in a movie. In the case of the art object, the most sensitive nucleus, namely its authenticity, this is good, is interfered with, whereas no natural object is vulnerable on that score. The authenticity of a thing is the essence of all that is transmissible from its beginning, ranging from its substantive duration to its testimony to the history which it has experienced. right? Since the historical testimony rests on the authenticity, the former two is jeopardized by reproduction when substantive duration comes to matter. And what is really jeopardized when the historical testimony is affected by the authority of the object? One might assume the eliminated element in the term aura and go on to say that which withers, and you notice the language here, in the age of technical reproduction is the aura of the work of art. This is a symptomatic process whose significance points beyond the realm of art. One might generalize by saying the technique of reproduction detaches the reproduced object from the domain of tradition. By making many reproductions, it substitutes a plurality of copies for a unique experience, right? Or existence, excuse me. And in permitting the reproduction to meet the beholder or listener in its own particular situation, it reactivates the object reproduced. These two processes lead to a tremendous shattering of tradition, which is the obverse of the contemporary crisis and renewal of mankind. Both processes are intimately connected with the contemporary mass movements. Their most powerful agent is the film. Its social significance, particularly in the most positive form, is inconceivable without its destructive, cathartic aspect, the liquidation of the traditional value of the cultural heritage. This phenomenon is most palpable in the great historical films. It extends to ever new positions, and here's Abel Gance early on. In 1917, Abel Gance exclaimed enthusiastically, "Shakespeare, Rembrandt, Beethoven will make films. All legends, all mythologies, and all myths, all founders of religion and the very religions await their exposed resurrection, and the heroes crowd each other at the gate." Presumably without intending it, he issued an invitation to a far-reaching liquidation. Very interesting, right? The way Abel Gance is used here in its context, right? To a far-reaching liquidation, right? Okay, so this then becomes important too, the history of the senses. You know, this to me is a great commentary, this number 3 on Marx's great saying in the Economic and Paris manuscripts, the theoretician of the senses. Yeah, he uses this great phrase. You know, one thing about Marx and the Fourbachian Marxism, if you will, in terms of sensuous materialism, is this whole emphasis upon we really haven't experienced our senses yet. You know, the theoretician of the senses. This is very, very beautiful, you know, the way this plays out. And I think Benjamin in some ways is doing, I mean, look, maybe it's an unconscious commentary, maybe I'm superimposing it into the text, but I think it's a good background to kind of read it, you know, this section number 3. So during long periods of history, the mode of human sense perception changes with humanity's entire mode of experience, right? And this is great. Again, always historicized, as Jameson reminds us, Marx too, we're always dealing with historical time, right? The manner in which human sense perception is organized, the medium in which it is accomplished, is determined not only by nature, but by historical circumstances as well, right? Okay. The 5th century, with its great shifts of population, saw the birth of the late Roman art industry and the Vienna Genesis, and there developed not only an art different from that of antiquity, but also a new kind of perception. The scholars of the Viennese schools, Alois Riegel and Wyckoff, who resisted the weight of classical tradition under which these later art forms had been buried, were the first to draw conclusions from them concerning the organization of perception at the time. However far-reaching their insight, these scholars limited themselves. This is interesting. He's going after Alois Riegel, he's a heavyweight, which characterized perception in late Roman times. They did not attempt, and perhaps saw no way, to show the social transformations expressed by these changes in perception. Yeah, right? The conditions for an analogous insight are more favorable in the present. And if changes in the medium of contemporary perception can be comprehend it as decay of the aura, it is possible to show their social causes. So we have another intention around this term, aura, obviously, to be comprehended as a decay of the aura and its social implications. Very, very important around this too as well, yeah, as symptomatic. The concept of aura, which was proposed above with reference to historical objects, may be usefully be illustrated with reference to the aura of natural ones as well. We define the aura of the latter as the unique phenomena of a distance, however close it may be. If while resting on a summer afternoon, you follow with your eyes a mountain range on the horizon or a branch which casts its shadow over you, you experience the aura of those mountains and that breach. Right? This image makes it easy to comprehend the social basis of the contemporary decay of the aura. It rests on two circumstances, both of which are related to the increasing significance of the masses in contemporary life, the significance of the masses in contemporary life, namely the desire of contemporary masses to bring things closer, spatially and humanly. Right? And I always think here of Leonard Cohen's great phrase, the rich have their channels in the bedrooms of the poor. I really think that's a very good saying of his. It's a very beautiful phrase of his, that he came up with among so many of them. But yeah, the rich have their channels in the bed. Everybody knows, right? Yeah. The deal is rotten. Old Joe is still picking cotton, right? In a way, yeah. The rich have their channels in the bedroom of the poor. Anyway, so yeah, closer spatially and humanly, which is just as ardent as they're bent towards overcoming the uniqueness of every reality by accepting its reproduction. Nobody asks, where does this come from? What was this a riff on, etc.? How is this being reduplicated, reproduced constantly? What is going on? Very few people ask those questions. Just, oh, wow. Oh man, that's great, right? Even though it's been around forever and it's being recycled and reduplicated so many times ad infinitum, right? Every day the urge grows stronger to get hold of an object at very close range by way of its likeness, its reproduction. Unmistakably, reproduction is offered by picture magazines, newsreels differs from the image seen by the unarmed eye. Uniqueness and permanence are as closely linked in the latter as are transitoriness and reproducibility in the former. To pry an object from its shell to destroy its aura is the mark of a perception whose sense of the universal equality of things has increased to such a degree that it extracts it even from a unique object by means of reproduction. Thus, is manifest in the field of perception what in the theoretical sphere is noticeable in the increasing importance of statistics and marketing, ratings. You can go through this, the Grammys, the hit parade, all these kind of things that are happening, right? Downbeat's ranking of saxophone players. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, right. The adjustment of reality to the masses and of the masses to reality is a process of unlimited scope, as much as thinking as for perception. So much for thinking as for perception. So this is very interesting again on the aura and its multiple levels of contradictoriness, but also what its loss means to the masses as well, right? And how
Michael, this is actually a place where, again, it wasn't clear to me. On one level, he's talking about the adjustment to reality. Later on, he talks about distraction, and you get sort of an image of passivity, right? Or sort of receiving something, but he's also talking, again later about a kind of a critical facility also, and it seems a little ambiguous. And then the other question, as you were reading this, I was thinking, what would he write in the age of Twitter? I mean, we've in one way we've gone so far beyond this, in a certain way that but I find that interesting to try and think about, where it's not just the object but it's ourselves, that we can self-reproduce.
right.
It's like we've kind of moved into the realization of this many, many times over. It's just interesting to, think about that. So.
Right. Well, it's certainly a very predictive essay, right, in the sense of what would happen, right, when you reproduce all this, and the extension of the cybernetic as well, right? I mean, there is this, kind of anticipation, if you will, of the cyberspace in so many ways. And I'll try to go back over that, because I've been reading, I found a book of Henri Lefebvre's writings, during his time when he just left the Communist Party. And he says, why philosophy? And he has very interesting things to say about the cybernetic revolution. And this is something, again, we are very much under theorized. What has it done, through the mathematical? And, the Frankfurt School never went the way of the mathematical, and, how important it really is. I mean, this is very, very significant to me. You see this in terms of Siegfried Gideon, who is reading, right, in a way, has that mathematical ability. But the cybernetics itself, the moment around Norbert Wiener, and others of that period, Bateson, these people were really good at mathematics. This was part of a real governmental, new thinking of control, right? Control and communication, in a sense. So in a way, Benjamin is even more subversive today, in a sense. I mean, we're scratching the surface. But if you read this seriously in the age of the cybernetic, and he and Heidegger have this in mind, I think, too. I don't think he would have liked the cybernetic reproducibility, in some ways. I mean, we can talk about this more. I mean, to me, the issue is really, is the aura and recapturing aura, or getting back to this phenomena of Erfahrung, this practical hand-me-down, right, in a sense, or this tension that goes between succession and catastrophe. Is this something we have to really rethink and recast today? And I think he gives us a lot of ammunition to do so. There's a lot of
it seems like Heidegger is very much about sort of the rehabilitation, or trying to recapture what Benjamin is talking about in terms of the aura, the thing, the object, this kind of presence. And but just to jump at
no, it's okay.
Just to jump ahead, there's this later section where he's talking about film actors in Russia, that the actor is no longer portraying somebody else, they are portraying themselves, right? And that, then we get to the documentary, as a form that I think evolves a little later. And then, it's interesting how that, I felt that was very prescient in terms of where we are today, in terms of how, in one sense, we can all produce our own video, we can produce our own, right? And that what we are portraying is not us as somebody else, it's us that's become what we're actually. So
we might not know what that us is.
Right.
Of this. So that's another problem that we're facing too.
Absolutely.
Whatever happened to subjectivity, and I'm not being nostalgic for the language of subjectivity and consciousness, but in some senses, what is the self? Is there such a thing now as a selbst or a self? And that language of the self, what is this notion of the subject, which was an attempt, again, to recapture experience in French philosophy. I mean, these people weren't playing around, the Lacans and, the Althussers, et cetera. This was really, again, reading Capital is basically an attempt to get back to experience. He doesn't say this, but he says we're facing our greatest trials today, the trial of reading and writing. He says this in the beginning of a Reading Capital. Yeah, please, yeah.
I see a connection here as well that just struck me, which is that one of the most fascinating parts of the Benjamin essay is this idea of the masses bringing things closer, and as opposed to the distance, the mediation. And what strikes me comparing that to Heidegger is Heidegger's concern is that being is retreating, and this feeling that with technology, we may lose. He says he always has these things of the nearness, nears, the nahe, and he has these verbs of nearness. And the concern, he says, is in what is called thinking, he says this very clearly, is will we lose, being, or will we lose this, and will it escape from us? And then later, it's only a God can save us. So I think Heidegger, it's much more of the angst of, if this retreats from us as human beings, or whoever it is, Dasein, we will be lost. And therefore we need this turn, we need this. Whereas with Benjamin, it's much different trajectory, I would say.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it's a notion of catastrophe versus there's what you said, the wrong path was taken in the metaphysical epoch, right? In a sense, yeah, this notion of catastrophe, ruin, et cetera, is more. Karl Jaspers used the phrase, we're all shipwrecked. That was another thing. So this was all part of this, kind of the advent, if you will, of modernity, modernism in the arts, high modernism, all these things. And then, of course, now we have, all these categories like the postmodern, the post this, the post that, et cetera. And all post means is location, in a sense. It's not after in many ways, or it's both before and after, in a sense, temporally. And, it's actually a topos. And I like this about Heidegger. He gives us some kind of, language to deal with all these posts, right? In a sense, right? Yeah. But you're right. I mean, the nearness and farness. I mean, look, again, there's a lot of thinking in paradoxical and contradictory terms here. Obviously the paradox, they say every distance is not near, but I swear I see my reflection. So in many ways, the distance and nearness is, part of Heidegger's tension, obviously, that's going on. But in him, it's the forgetfulness. Not so much the aura, it's the forgetfulness through the stream of lethe that is going on. Lethe is the forgetfulness, right? In a sense. So Benjamin could write, again, if he's going to do this narratologically, or he's going to do it through, in my opinion, if he does it through, the structure of catastrophe, could take lethe up as part of the catastrophe, right? that is but hitting us here. But again, this is not programmatic, in some senses, but it is the case, if you will. We need this revolutionary weapons in the hand, if you will, of the masses, film and photography. This is something that will actually be progressive, And I'm not sure Adorno's on that same page, but let's see how he unfolds this. Maybe we'll do one more section and then. So the uniqueness, right, of the work of art is inseparable from being embedded in the fabric of tradition. This is very much Gramsci too. Gramsci is a radical conservative, and this is a statement of radical conservatism here, right? The tradition. This tradition itself is thoroughly alive and extremely changeable. An ancient statue of Venus, for example, stood in the different traditional context with the Greeks, who made it into an object of veneration, than with the clerics of the Middle Ages, right? Which is funny, you can think about this. Good book on sexuality, right? Who viewed it as an ominous idol, right? Both of them, however, were equally confronted with its uniqueness, that is, its aura, right? Again, right? Originally, the contextual integration of art in tradition found its expression in the cult. We know that the earliest artworks originated in the service of a ritual, first the magical, then the religious time. I mean, he forgot to mention the orgy, but there's a long tradition of this. And of course, Dionysius, right? Because this goes back to the Nietzschean distinction that's very, very clever, the Apollonian and the Dionysius, right? In ancient Greek tragedy. Very much that the Dionysian is, where the world of tragedy in that realm is, and where, in some ways, the aura is produced. Anyway, so originally the contextual is found in the cult. We know that the earliest artworks originated in the service of a ritual. First the magical, then the religion, and significance that the existence of the work of art with reference to its aura is never entirely separated from its ritual function, right? In many ways, right? So in other words, the unique value of the authentic work of art has its basis in ritual, the location of its original use value. I like this, right? This ritualistic basis, however remote, is still recognizable as secularized ritual, even the most profane forms of the cult of beauty. For example, I would recommend too, I mean, look, I know there's only so much time in the day and we're not all spring chickens here in some ways, but anyway, Norbert Elias's The Civilizing Process goes through this. Norbert Elias was a peripheral member of the Frankfurt School, but learned a lot and is very good on this sentence I just read, right, in terms of ritual and thing. We were thinking of doing a class on food as thought, food as ritual, right, and etc. So we may do that. Do Levi Strauss's The Origin of Table Manners and this kind of stuff. But Elias is really good, the civilizing process on this. So the secular cult of beauty developed during the Renaissance and prevailing for 3 centuries clearly showed the ritualistic basis in its decline and the first deep crisis which befell it. With the advent of the first truly revolutionary means of reproduction, photography, simultaneous with the rise of socialism, art sensed the approaching crisis, right, which has become evident a century later. At the time, art reacted with the doctrine of art for art's sake, that is, with a theology of art. This gave rise to what would be called a negative theology in the form of the idea of pure art, which not only denied any social function of art, but also any categorizing by subject matter. In poetry, Mallarmé, the coup d'idée, was the first to take this position. An analysis of art in the age of technical reproduction must do justice to these relationships, for they lead us to an all-important insight. For the first time in world history, technical reproduction emancipates the work of art from its parasitical dependence on ritual. This is the first point he's really making. This is very important. To an ever greater degree, the work of art reproduced becomes the work of art designed for reproducibility. From a photographic negative, for one example, one can take any number of prints or ask for the authentic print, and Sean, please correct Walter Benjamin if he's wrong, makes no sense. But the instant the criterion of authenticity ceases to be applicable to artistic production, the total function of art is reversed. Instead of being based on ritual, it begins to be based on another practice, politics. This is very, very important, this section number 4. I mean,
how do you interpret that? Like in the sense of,
well, he goes on to the next, okay, but go ahead. I mean, the new function, he'll go into the new function in section 5. I mean, the beauty of this is that these are propositions, done that unfold into new spheres each time. It's a very dialectically, with all due respect to Adorno, this is a very dialectically constructed thesis on, on the age of the artwork in the age of technical reproduction. So there's a dialectic working here, Carl, that is really trying to unfold these spheres, right? When he makes these comments, it's not just we stop there, we want to see how that sphere unfolds in the next passage, because he's going to go into the politics function, right? The new function of art versus that of it being based in ritual, right? Yeah. But so this is what he's doing. Political, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, we can take this up next class, but I think this is, to me, very interesting. But I don't think he's saying necessarily that all, quote, creative practice should be subsumed to propaganda, right?
No, you didn't say that.
No,
he said politics.
Right.
He didn't say propaganda.
It's. I think that there's some ambiguity, but when you get to the end of the essay about what exactly he's proposing, at least as I read it.
Well, we can go over that. I mean, look, and again, one of the reasons I wanted to do the background, he has he has these hearing models, right, that he works on, in his radio days, right, if you will. These are didactic ways of hearing, didactic ways of thinking. So you can see here there's multiple, there are multiple, methodological and, obviously anxieties of influence working through this text. And one is certainly the presence of Bertolt Brecht and theater as didacticism, right? And that maybe that application to distantiation, nearness, and farness, right? In terms of alienation effect. And what does that produce in the world? And how does art get outside of the aura of ritual, the ritual, right? In some ways, what is happening there? That sort of Brechtian function in the theater. The epic theater is a way of getting away from the aura of Aristotelian political catharsis, right? In a sense, or the tragic notion of theater, or the Greek notion of the theater, right? Both in tragedy and comedic forms, and how this has worked, right? Etc. Just like Godard says, a film needs no beginning, middle, or end. That's a way of getting outside of the narrative or closure, right? In a certain way. So I think these are all important things. What he's really trying to do here is first, talk about aura in the sense of, looking at history and looking at the tendencies in its historical moment. He's very much in the present, art for art's sake. Mallarmé, right, in terms of the turn of the century into a different kind of poetry, poetics, right, etc. Later on, and but the authenticity is no longer an issue, right, in terms of what he's saying ceases to be applicable because the total function of art is reversed. I don't think he's saying it's only programmatic here. He's actually talking about a historical process. What's going on in terms of, this notion of the auratic object, what happens, right, etc. Right. So in many ways. So what is the politics of this now? So let me just go real quickly to the thing and then I'll stop. Works of art are received and valued on different planes. Two polar types stands out. With one, the accent is on its cult value. The other on the exhibition value. So he's going to go now in terms of its two values, right? Based on this new notion, right? Artistic production begins with ceremonial objects destined to serve in a cult. One may assume what was mattered was their existence, not their being on view. The elk portrayed by the man of the Stone Age on the walls of his caves was an instrument of magic. He did expose it to his fellow men, but in the main, it was meant for the spirits. Today, the cult value would seem to demand that the work of art remain hidden. Certain statues of, and really you could talk about this in terms of Heidegger's The Origin of the Work of Art. It'd be maybe good to maybe read this alongside. These are two major works in aesthetics, right? Benjamin's, the work of art in the age of technical reproduction, and of course, Heidegger's The Origin of the Work of Art, because what the work of art is concealing something. It must bring out something, that origin. The play between mortals and divinities, that play between, earth and sky or horizon, that's playing off the fourfold in Heidegger's sense. But Benjamin is looking at value here. He's a Marxist. He's really a materialist in many ways. He's looking at exhibition and cult value here. So this is very important. So let me just go down the thing. He says, with the different methods, this is the last paragraph, and we'll stop there and we'll go back to this next week. With the different methods of technical reproduction of a work of art, its fitness for exhibition increased to such an extent that the quantitative shift between in two poles turns into a qualitative transformation of its nature. This is comparable to the situation of the work of art in prehistoric times, when by the absolute emphasis on its cult value, it was first and foremost an instrument of magic. Only later did it come to be recognized as a work of art. In the same way today, by the absolute emphasis on its exhibition value, right, the work of art becomes a creation with entirely new functions, among which one we are conscious of, the artistic function, later may be recognized as incidental. This much is certain. Today, photography and the film are the most multiple exemplifications of this new function. So this is where he's going to go. These are the two revolutionary, moments, of the 20th century, photography and film. And by the way, I guess most of you knew Stanley, or some of you had classes with him. I mean, he wrote a very good book, Film, High Art of Capitalism, The High Art of Capitalism. For first of all, he wrote it as a polemic with Annette Michelson in the Soviet school, right? In some ways, he actually took the position of Vertov. But it was reproduced in the journal that Annette Michelson and Rosalind Krauss founded, October, right, later. So there was a kind of come around. But anyway, we're looking again at these two moments that he really considers art of the masses, right, in many ways, right? And so I don't know, any questions or thoughts before we close out? I mean, I think this is probably, I guess, a good place, and we'll pick it up next week. I'm in no rush, I mean, I don't know about you guys. I like this notion of taking it slow. I'm like Benjamin, we should pull the emergency brake and have a lot of reflection and thinking about these things. Yeah. But any thoughts, Carl? I mean, look, I would really like us to, look at this. He's doing this for a reason. He's really unfolding in his dialectical way, and to follow his processes, in a sense. And, I don't think he's really trying to be didactic yet, right? It is a dialectical unfolding of the optic. It's an optic that's unfolding here, right? In many ways, to use Susan Buck-Morss's language, right?
Yeah, I mean, just not to open other cans of worms, but reading this again, I read this a long time ago, made me think of John Berger, The Ways of Seeing, and what he does. He made a popular show for BBC.
Yeah.
And his notion of the bulletin board, which I think was, in some ways, he's drawing a lot on this essay. I mean, he actually says that, and the bulletin board, when I think of it, it's almost like, today the Facebook page. I mean, again, there's sort of this prescient anticipation, which is very interesting. And then I just wonder how this essay might dialogue with Society of the Spectacle, which is another way of trying to understand this transformation. I mean, that's a whole.
Yeah, no, these are two crucial, the ways of seeing and Berger's notion, in many ways, and the BBC presentation obviously is taking part of its point of departure from Benjamin's essay, and Du Bois is very well aware of this. The whole situationist movement, knew of this. I mean, this essay was out there, it was traveling in Europe. We didn't get it until the 60s, right? Du Bois, by the time this is published in English, Du Bois has already written the Society of the Spectacle. Right. So there's a lot incorporated. I mean, I just taught the Society of the Spectacle, the first two sections. So I mean, it's pretty active in my mind right now. But I mean, we could certainly make moves to that. I mean, and the commodification of the image, right? The second chapter, for example, right? Is very, very Benjaminian inspired in many ways. And the inverse that's happening too. I mean, Du Bois is very good, very, very rigorous dialectician too. I mean, in his way. It's a very, very good book. I mean, the first one is about what was it? It's a play on Feuerbach and theology and inversion. How the thing. So in some ways, he's going through the rituals, Du Bois, of theology through Feuerbach's critique of this, and the anthropomorphic projections of theology, right? And what's going on there. Benjamin's doing the same thing with cult value back in the day. I mean, this could be read also. Remember, he's also friends with the Collège de Sociologie, which I didn't mention today. I should have done that earlier. He knows Bataille. He knows all these characters very well. He hung out at the Collège de Sociologie. He was a member in the group. He was very upset with Bataille. Yeah.
Another really fascinating thing,
Yeah,
I
so,
think is kind of
yeah.
a link, to John Berger is the essay he wrote on cubism, where he's talking about new sciences and new technologies are allowing us to penetrate into a realm of matter that had henceforth just been, the realm of God or this
Right.
absolute mystery. And how Benjamin talks about that in terms of these new techniques. There's that great section of the magician versus the
Yeah.
surgeon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sort of
Yeah,
this new, way of apprehending, cutting into, rearranging, splicing. And then, the Cubist aesthetic, which in some sense, Berger argues, if I remember correctly, that Cubism was sort of reproducing that revolutionary view of the world that was being transformed at that time, around the turn of the
sure,
century.
sure.
So all these things are kind of happening
Yeah,
together. Physics is undergoing a revolution.
absolutely.
It's a fascinating set of
Yeah, sure.
parallels that are going on here.
Yeah, well, that's the beauty of a comprehensive approach to history, right? And the cross fertilization between all these things. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And they're aware of it. I mean, look, the Frankfurt School didn't really have a lot to say about science other than in terms of its, the aspect of domination of nature. They were against scientism, but they never really had the people that were working in that domain. We had to go elsewhere for that,
Mhm.
and in a lot of ways. Yeah, no, you're absolutely correct. But Heidegger's well aware of all this stuff. Heidegger's dialogues are not only with Einstein, it's also a conversation with Bergson and certainly a conversation with Heisenberg throughout. You get this from Being in Time, chapter, the last section, 82, the footnote on Being in Time. This is really very important, his whole notion of temporality. That's one way of reading the text, is through that long footnote at the end of Being in Time. Yeah. And because it's really in terms of the new discoveries and, in physics, right? Yeah. So, no, I hear you there. But he's dealing with art, right? He's dealing with this revolutionary nature. And then again, what is the historical dynamic that is not only playing out here, but how ultimately does this play well? I mean, he's going to go over Abel Gance again in exhibition value. He'll bring him up again, and the artistic value of painting versus photography. That's the context in which he mentions Abel Gance, where we were earlier with Douglas, right? So yeah. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot here. I mean, again, I would like us to see it, unfold, because this is, again, we're in the presence of a real brilliance. We don't have to say we buy it lock, stock, and barrel, as they say in America. But there's really a very beautiful, sense of how this is being unfolded section by section, right? And many distinctions that go on. Exhibition value dominates the art world. They have mastered the cult. Just look at the movement from Leo Castelli and abstract expressionism to today, in terms of the galleries in Chelsea, how much the art world dominates, is dominated by the gallery owners, right? The so-called stable of artists, right? Etc. Yeah, yeah. Look at the history of abstract expressionism, at the expense of the Mexican muralists. And you can talk about that too in this way too. What was the exhibition value of that versus that of the Mexican muralists? There's some good work on this stuff. Yeah. Why is it that Rivera, Siqueiros, and others, and then the muralist too, what was his name? The one, Orozco. Why aren't these people as present, during this period as, Pollock, Franz Klein, de Kooning, et cetera, down the line, Mark Rothko, Clifford Still, yeah, et cetera. So I think there's a lot here to, really work with to kind of situate ourselves once again, yeah. And to look at it that way.
Just,
What's that?
this